Hello there and welcome to Biology with Charles, where curiosity gets cosy and science takes the scenic route to slumber. Tonight we're settling in with a question that sounds simple on the surface, and then, rather like a hungry stomach at 4 in the afternoon, becomes quite impossible to ignore. What happens to your body if you eat once a day? Not in a vague, hand-wavy sort of way, and not in the brisk style of someone waving a diet book at you from across the internet, but slowly, patiently, hour by hour, tissue by tissue, hormone by hormone, as your body does what it has always done best: adapt, negotiate, conserve, release, complain a little, and carry on. It is one of those topics that tends to arrive wearing two very different outfits. On one side, it appears dressed as discipline, efficiency, and modern food strategy. On the other, it shows up looking ancient, almost familiar, because humans did not evolve with a snack drawer in every room, a glowing refrigerator in every kitchen, and the ability to obtain a blueberry muffin with the push of a thumb. For most of history, eating was not a neatly scheduled trilogy of breakfast, lunch and dinner with a few bonus nibbles scattered in between. It was patchier than that, sometimes abundant, sometimes delayed, sometimes inconvenient, and sometimes shaped entirely by what the day would allow. So when someone chooses to eat once a day now, they are doing something that can sound either cutting edge or oddly prehistoric, depending on who's describing it. Your body, meanwhile, does not care much for branding. It does not ask whether your meal plan is fashionable, ancestral, minimalist, or part of a spreadsheet. It simply receives signals, checks the fuel tanks, adjusts the chemistry, and sends out messages in return. Some of those messages feel clear and dramatic. Hunger, satisfaction, sleepiness, sharpness, irritability, relief. Others happen quietly, in the liver, the pancreas, the fat cells, the muscles, the brain. Small changes in insulin here, a shift in glycogen there, a bit of hormone negotiation behind the scenes like a committee meeting no one remembers scheduling. Before we wander into all of that, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from, and perhaps just as importantly, what time is it where you are right now? Are you hearing this in the soft hours of late evening, when the kitchen is dark and the house has finally stopped making daytime noises? Is it early morning, with that particular kind of silence that feels almost borrowed? Or maybe it is the middle of the afternoon, and your stomach has very strong opinions about the subject already. There is something nicely fitting about that, I think. A conversation about eating once a day always lands at a different moment in each listener's body. Some of you are well fed, some of you are peckish, some of you are probably remembering a sandwich from 3 hours ago and wondering whether it still counts as emotionally recent. If you find this soothing, interesting, or simply a nice companion for the quieter part of your day, do give the video a like and maybe subscribe as well. It helps this small corner of calm science find more people who enjoy falling asleep somewhere between metabolism and mild amusement. And if this topic should happen to make you slightly more aware of your own appetite, then at least you'll be in good company. Human biology has a remarkable talent for turning abstract ideas into practical reminders. One can begin the evening contemplating insulin and end it thinking rather tenderly about toast. Now the phrase "eat once a day" sounds tidy, almost too tidy. It suggests a single event, neatly contained, like one grand meal placed in the middle of a clock face while the rest of the hours stand around politely waiting their turn. But your body does not experience it that way. Your body experiences it as a sequence. There is the meal itself, of course, with all the noise and chemistry of digestion beginning at once. Then there is the afterglow of feeding, the period when nutrients are being sorted, stored, burned and circulated. Then comes the long stretch after absorption begins to fade, when the body starts looking inward rather than outward for energy. That is where things become especially interesting, because hunger is not merely emptiness, and fasting is not simply nothing happening. Quite the opposite. A great many things happen when food does not arrive. They are simply quieter than chewing. We tend to imagine eating as the active part and not eating as the passive part, but in biological terms that is not really true. To eat is to receive material. To go without eating for many hours is to reveal strategy. The body begins asking useful questions. How much glucose is still circulating? How much glycogen is available in the liver? Are we expecting more food soon? Or should we become a bit more thrifty? Should insulin remain elevated? Or can it step back now? Shall the brain continue to demand its preferred fuel with full confidence, or might it need alternative arrangements later? The body is not dramatic about these questions. It does not slam doors or write stern memos. It recalibrates. That recalibration is what makes the one meal day so compelling to people. Some describe it as clarifying, almost simplifying, as though the daily negotiation with food has been reduced from a small opera to a single well-managed scene. Others find it uncomfortable, distracting, or socially inconvenient in exactly the way you might expect from a pattern that asks you to ignore pastries at noon and remain philosophical about them. Some feel energetic in the long fasting window. Some feel cold, moody, or preoccupied. Some overeat at the meal. Some cannot. Some discover that their body is surprisingly flexible. Others discover that their body has the temperament of a Victorian aunt who objects to any change in routine. And this is where the topic becomes much richer than diet folklore tends to allow. Because what happens depends partly on what is eaten in that one meal, partly on timing, partly on sleep, activity, body composition and metabolic health, and partly on the wonderfully inconvenient fact that human beings are not assembled on a factory line with identical settings. One person's steady concentration may be another person's headache. One person's peaceful appetite control may be another person's late evening raid on the pantry, conducted with all the calm restraint of a raccoon in a biscuit tin. Still, beneath those personal differences there is a recognizable pattern. The body follows certain broad rules. It likes balance when it can get it. It prefers immediate fuel when available. It stores surplus when prudent. It releases reserves when needed. It tries to keep blood glucose within a workable range because the brain is, for all its brilliance, something of a demanding tenant. It communicates through hormones, nerves, enzymes, and that most persuasive of biological messages, sensation. You may call it hunger, energy, fullness, brain fog, or lightheadedness. Your body calls it reporting. It helps, I think, to begin with an image so ordinary it barely feels scientific. Imagine a household after a large grocery delivery. Bags are unpacked. Fresh food is placed where it belongs. Things for later are stored away. A few items are used immediately. The kitchen feels abundant. There is motion, sorting, handling, a sense that the shelves are properly supplied. That is your fed state. Nutrients are coming in, insulin rises, glucose is handled, amino acids move into circulation, fats are packaged and transported, and the body begins making decisions about what to use right away and what to set aside for later. Now imagine the same house many hours after that delivery. The counters are clear, the visible food has mostly been dealt with, but the house has not become helpless. It has cupboards, a freezer, things in reserve. It simply changes behaviour. Instead of unloading new supplies, it starts drawing from what was stored earlier. That is much closer to what your metabolism is doing in a prolonged stretch without food. It is not panicking, at least not in a healthy person, over a normal fasting window. It is shifting source material. The rhythm changes from receiving to withdrawing. That shift is so central to human survival that it is woven deeply into our biology. If the body could only function while food was actively being eaten, our species would not have survived a single inconvenient winter, failed hunt, stormy crossing, long migration, missed harvest, or family argument that accidentally delayed supper. We are built not merely to consume, but to bridge gaps between consumption. The one-meal day exaggerates that gap in a modern setting, which is why it can feel so powerful. It turns up the volume on processes that are usually shared more evenly across several meals. There is also something psychologically peculiar about it. Most of us do not experience hunger as a straight line. It comes in waves, moods, suggestions, reminders, habits, and associations. You walk past a bakery and suddenly discover a deep emotional commitment to croissants. You sit through a long meeting and decide with great conviction that your body is on the brink of collapse, only to forget this entirely 10 minutes later. Hunger, it turns out, is not simply the stomach crying into the void. It is a collaboration between the brain, hormones, routine, expectation, smell, sight, memory, stress, sleep, and timing. Which is why the one meal day is not just a test of fuel availability, it is also a test of how much of your eating life is truly biological need, and how much is ritual, environment, and opportunity wearing biology's hat. That does not mean it is imaginary. Far from it. Hunger is real, appetite is real, cravings are real. Low blood sugar in the wrong context is very real indeed. But they do not all emerge from the same place, and they do not all follow the same clock. Part of what makes an hour by hour look so useful is that it lets us see when certain feelings are likely to arise and why. The body after 2 hours is not the body after 10. The body after 16 is not behaving like the body after 4. You may still feel like yourself the whole time, but a good deal of chemistry has changed under the floorboards, and then there is the social layer, which biology never fully escapes. To eat once a day is not only to alter metabolism, it is to change the texture of the day. Meals are not just refueling events, they are pauses, markers, excuses, traditions, negotiations, and sometimes the only part of a busy schedule that resembles a ceremony. Remove 2 of them, and the day feels different even before the body says a word. There is more empty time around food, more anticipation, more distance between one satisfaction and the next. Some people find that liberating. Others find it faintly unsettling, like removing furniture from a room and discovering the echo underneath. So tonight, or this morning, or wherever this finds you, we're not going to reduce the whole subject to a neat moral about whether eating once a day is good or bad, wise or foolish, disciplined or absurd. Biology is usually less dramatic and more specific than that. Instead, we're going to do something a bit more interesting. We're going to follow the body through the day, as though we were accompanying it quietly from room to room, watching the lights go on and off in different systems. We'll see what happens just after the meal, when digestion is in full swing and the body is flush with incoming material. We'll see what changes a few hours later when the easy energy begins to thin out. We'll notice when hunger tends to make its first formal introduction, and when stored fuel starts taking the matter into its own capable hands. We'll watch hormones trade notes, the liver become increasingly important, fat tissue grow less decorative and more relevant, and the brain respond in ways that can feel either wonderfully clear or mildly theatrical depending on the person involved. There is no need to rush it. Bodies rarely do their most interesting work while being hurried. Even now, as you sit or lie there listening, yours is performing countless acts of management without demanding applause. Your heart is keeping time. Your liver is balancing supplies. Your brain is integrating signals from blood, gut, and memory. Your stomach, if empty, may be sending little waves of muscular activity in preparation for a meal that has not yet appeared. Or perhaps you have eaten recently, and everything is still occupied with digestion, happily dismantling dinner into molecules small enough to become you. That, in the end, is the quiet marvel beneath all of this. Eating once a day is not merely about restraint or schedule. It is about the body's astonishing ability to move between states, from fed to fasting, from storing to releasing, from anticipating to adapting, from thank goodness lunch to very well we shall consult the liver. We do not usually notice these transitions in detail because modern life is so good at interrupting them with another coffee, another snack, another handful of something taken, standing up in the kitchen while looking for entirely different food. Stretch that interval out, and the underlying machinery becomes easier to hear. So let's begin where all such days truly begin for the body, not with sunrise, not with discipline, and not with a brave declaration on a fasting app, but with the final mouthful of the meal itself. The fork is set down, the swallowing is done, the digestive tract is already at work, and somewhere deep in the ordinary miracle of your insides, the clock has started. So let us stay with that final mouthful for a moment, because this is where the day of eating once begins in earnest. Not when you first felt hungry, not when you decided you were definitely, absolutely only going to have one meal today and not just a little something at 11:40, but here, at the end of the meal, when the fork is down, the chewing is done, and the body quietly receives the message that supplies have arrived. This is the point at which the internal timetable changes. A little earlier, your body was preparing, anticipating, perhaps even negotiating. Now it has something concrete to work with. That last bite matters more than it seems. By the time you swallow it, digestion is already well underway. In fact, your body has been getting ready since before the first bite. The smell of food, the sight of it, the routine of sitting down to eat, all of these can trigger what is known as the cephalic phase response. That sounds rather grand for something that may begin with smelling roast chicken or seeing a bowl of pasta, but it simply means your nervous system is not waiting passively for food to hit the stomach before getting involved. Saliva increases, digestive juices begin to stir, insulin can nudge upward in anticipation, and the gastrointestinal tract starts behaving less like an empty corridor and more like a railway station 10 minutes before a train comes in. Chewing, dull though it may sound compared with glamorous topics like ketones and metabolism, is where the entire business begins to become practical. Food is broken down mechanically by the teeth, mixed with saliva, and eased into a form the rest of the digestive system can handle without lodging a formal complaint. Saliva contains enzymes, most notably salivary amylase, which begins breaking down starches almost immediately. It is not a full meal's worth of digestion, of course. No one is living entirely by the power of mouth enzymes. But it does mean that the moment food enters the mouth, the body stops treating the outside world as not me, and starts converting it, piece by piece, into something useful. The swallowed food moves down the esophagus by a series of muscular contractions called peristalsis, which is one of those quietly competent biological processes you rarely thank unless it goes wrong. The food reaches the stomach, and now the one meal day becomes a very specific physiological event. If the meal is large, and for many people eating once a day it usually is, the stomach expands noticeably. Stretch receptors in the stomach wall register this expansion and begin sending signals to the brain. This is one of the first reasons you start feeling fuller, not because nutrients have all been absorbed already. That takes time. But because the stomach is saying, in effect, thank you, yes, there is definitely something to report. This early fullness is partly mechanical and partly chemical. The stomach is not merely a sac. It is an active organ with muscular walls, acid-producing cells, and a strong interest in keeping the contents moving at a pace that is useful rather than catastrophic. Hydrochloric acid begins breaking down food, especially proteins, while the enzyme pepsin starts clipping long protein chains into smaller fragments. The stomach churns, mixes, squeezes, and transforms the meal into a semi-liquid mass called chyme, which is less appetizing as a word than as a process. Nature, as ever, is more concerned with function than branding. At the same time, the composition of that meal matters tremendously. A meal rich in refined carbohydrates will behave differently from one heavy in protein, fat, and fibre. A large bowl of white rice with sweet sauce will produce one pattern of glucose and insulin. A plate built around eggs, fish, beans, vegetables, olive oil, perhaps some potatoes or grains, produces another. Liquids behave differently from solids. Fibre slows things down. Fat slows stomach emptying. Protein tends to be especially potent when it comes to satiety signals. So although people often speak of eating once a day as if it were a single universal experience, The body is always asking a more annoying but more useful question. Once a day eating what exactly? Still, certain broad events happen in most cases. As chyme begins moving from the stomach into the small intestine, nutrient sensing becomes much more sophisticated. This is where the body starts assessing what kind of meal it has received. Carbohydrates are broken down into sugars, proteins into amino acids, fats into fatty acids and monoglycerides, and the lining of the small intestine begins absorbing these products with extraordinary efficiency. If the stomach is the mixing chamber, the small intestine is the main customs office, sorting, processing and forwarding incoming material to the rest of the body. Let us take carbohydrates first, because they tend to be the quickest to make themselves known. If your one meal contains a meaningful amount of digestible carbohydrate, glucose begins entering the bloodstream. Blood sugar rises, and the pancreas responds by releasing insulin. Insulin is often spoken about with the tone reserved for public figures who are blamed for absolutely everything, but in healthy physiology it is not a villain. It is a coordinator. It tells cells that energy is available. It helps move glucose out of the bloodstream and into tissues that can use it or store it. It encourages the liver and muscles to replenish glycogen, which is the body's stored form of carbohydrate. It signals that for now at least there is no immediate need to act as though famine is around the corner. That rise in insulin is one of the clearest differences between the fed state and the fasted state. Before the meal, insulin was relatively low and the body was becoming more reliant on internal stores. After the meal, insulin rises and the metabolic mood changes. Energy is coming in from outside. Glucose can be burned directly, the liver can stock up. Fat release from adipose tissue is suppressed for a while. In simple terms, the body shifts from "let us manage our reserves carefully" to good, there is fresh supply. Muscle tissue, if it is insulin sensitive, and especially if you have been active, is glad to take up some of that glucose. The liver too becomes busy. It receives nutrients directly from the digestive tract through the portal vein, which makes it something like the first major official to inspect incoming cargo. The liver stores some glucose as glycogen, processes amino acids, helps regulate blood sugar, and decides how best to handle the current abundance. It is one of the great steady administrators of the body, usually overworked, rarely praised, and alarmingly essential. Protein deserves its own quiet moment here because a single daily meal often has to do a lot of work. If you are only eating once, that meal must provide not just calories but building material. Amino acids from digested protein are absorbed and used for tissue repair, enzyme production, immune molecules, structural proteins, neurotransmitter precursors, and countless other purposes. The body does not merely burn food, it rebuilds itself from it. Skin cells, intestinal lining, muscle proteins, transport proteins in the blood, all of these depend on a steady supply of raw ingredients, which is why a one-meal pattern that skimps badly on protein can leave the body poorly supplied even if the calorie total looks respectable on paper. A body can be fed and undernourished at the same time, which is one of biology's less charming loopholes. Dietary fat takes a more scenic route. Unlike glucose and amino acids, which move directly into the bloodstream through the portal system, long-chain fats are packaged into particles called chylomicrons and sent first through the lymphatic system before entering the circulation. This sounds unnecessarily theatrical, but it works quite well. Fat digestion also relies on bile, produced by the liver and stored in the gallbladder, as well as pancreatic enzymes. If your meal is rich in fat, digestion and absorption will unfold more slowly, and stomach emptying tends to be delayed. This is one reason high-fat meals can feel satisfying for longer, though it can also mean feeling impressively full in a way that suggests perhaps optimism played too large a role at the dinner table. Now, while all this sorting and absorbing is going on, the gut is sending messages upward. The digestive tract is not just a pipe. It is an information-rich organ system with nerves, hormones, and opinions. Hormones such as cholecystokinin, peptide YY, and GLP-1 begin to rise in response to food, especially protein and fat. These help slow gastric emptying, promote satiety, and communicate with the brain that nourishment is underway. Ghrelin, the hormone often associated with hunger, tends to fall after eating. The vagus nerve carries signals from the gut to the brainstem, contributing to the feeling that you have eaten enough, or perhaps more than enough, or possibly enough for a medium-sized farm animal. This is important because the experience of fullness does not depend on a single switch being flipped. It is assembled from multiple streams of information: stomach stretch, nutrient detection in the intestine, hormonal changes, blood glucose levels, and even sensory satisfaction all play a role. That last one matters more than people sometimes admit. The body is not indifferent to taste, texture, and expectation. A meal that feels complete often produces a different appetite response than one that feels technically sufficient but emotionally unserious. This may be one reason people on one meal a day patterns sometimes prefer a substantial, clearly defined meal rather than nibbling on worthy but joyless foods that leave the mind unconvinced and the kitchen still suspiciously interesting. In the first hour after eating, most people are still solidly in the fed state. The stomach is working, nutrients are entering circulation, insulin is elevated to some degree, and the body is leaning on incoming fuel rather than stored reserves. Depending on the meal, there may be a sense of calm, warmth, drowsiness, or mental clarity. There may also be sleepiness, especially after a very large meal. This post-meal dip is not imaginary. Blood flow, autonomic shifts, changes in glucose and insulin, and simple digestive workload can all contribute to that feeling that perhaps lying down, just for a minute, would be one of history's better ideas. That said, the severity of this dip varies enormously. A meal rich in refined carbohydrates can create a sharp rise and then fall in blood glucose, especially in susceptible individuals, leading to that familiar post-lunch fog in which the brain remains technically online but clearly resents it. A meal with protein, fibre and fat tends to produce a slower, steadier response. Eating speed matters too. Swallowing a very large meal quickly can outpace satiety signals, leaving you overfull before the brain catches up. The gut and brain do communicate, but not with the urgency of a fire alarm, more with the pace of a thoughtful civil servant placing memos into the correct tray. One of the interesting features of eating once a day is that this fed period can feel unusually significant, because it is not just one meal among many, it is the meal. The body knows nothing about your dietary philosophy, of course, but it does respond to the simple fact that a large amount of energy has arrived after a long interval. Glycogen stores that may have been partially depleted are replenished. Blood nutrients are abundant. Insulin-sensitive tissues take in fuel. Protein synthesis gets a chance to proceed. For a while, the chemistry of scarcity is put on hold, but abundance is not the same as permanence. The body is practical. It uses what it needs, stores what it can, and begins preparing for the next stretch without food almost immediately. Even during the meal itself, that next interval is already being set up. Some glucose is burned, some is stored. Some dietary fat is packaged for delivery and storage. Amino acids are directed toward repair and synthesis, but excess amino acids are not stored in a neat protein pantry for future use. They must be handled in real time. This is one reason meal composition and total adequacy matter so much when eating once a day. The body is efficient, but it is not magical. It can adapt to longer intervals between meals, but it still needs a realistic supply of nutrients when the opportunity comes. The digestive tract also has to manage sheer volume. A large one-meal intake can feel fine for some and excessive for others. Stomach capacity varies, so does digestive comfort. Some people can eat a large mixed meal and feel pleasantly satisfied. Others feel bloated, overly full, reflux-prone, or simply burdened. This is not moral failure. It is anatomy, motility, meal composition, eating speed, and individual tolerance. The romantic fantasy of one noble feast sustaining a person elegantly through the day is, for some digestive systems, less a feast and more an administrative overload. and yet the body is impressively capable of handling these events. Consider what is happening simultaneously. The stomach is processing solids and liquids at different rates. The pancreas is releasing insulin and digestive enzymes. The liver is screening and directing incoming nutrients. The gallbladder contracts if fat is present. The intestinal lining is absorbing sugars, amino acids, minerals, vitamins, and lipids with remarkable selectivity. Hormones are rising and falling. The brain is receiving satiety signals, glucose updates, and sensory feedback. Adipose tissue, muscle, and liver are being told in effect to coordinate. If a city could unpack, sort, distribute, inventory, and store a major delivery with this level of seamlessness, we would all write admiring essays about logistics. By roughly the second hour after a mixed meal, much depends on what you ate and how much. Glucose may still be elevated, or it may be coming down toward baseline. Insulin may still be relatively high, or easing downward. The stomach may still be noticeably full if the meal was large, fatty, or fibre-rich. The small intestine is still deeply occupied. Satiety hormones continue their work. If the meal provided enough energy and protein, you may feel grounded and content. If it was too small, too sugary, or poorly balanced, a person might begin feeling that odd dissatisfaction where the body has definitely eaten, yet the appetite remains unconvinced, like a committee that attended the meeting but refuses to approve the minutes. This is also where individual insulin sensitivity begins to shape the experience. In a metabolically healthy person, the rise and fall of glucose and insulin after a meal are generally well controlled. In someone with insulin resistance, the same meal may provoke a larger or more prolonged insulin response, a less tidy return of blood glucose toward baseline, and a different pattern of energy and hunger later. That does not mean every person who feels sleepy after lunch has entered metabolic tragedy. Sometimes they have simply eaten a heroic amount of noodles. But it does mean that the hour-by-hour story of eating once a day is never purely about willpower. Physiology has a leading role. Meanwhile, there is a quieter shift happening in the brain's relationship to food. Immediately after a large meal, the urgency of hunger is usually gone. Food cues may lose some of their power. The smell of toast from another room becomes less personally significant. The part of the brain that was keenly interested in obtaining food settles down. This is not just psychology. Hormonal and neural signals alter reward processing and attention. A fed brain behaves differently from a hungry one. It is less vigilant about food, less inclined to interpret every bakery as destiny. Still, the body is already moving along the timeline. The last bite did not stop the clock. It started it. Every minute after the meal is a minute in which nutrients are being handled, stores are being adjusted, and the fed state is gradually moving towards something else. Not abruptly, not dramatically, and not with the melodrama sometimes found in diet culture, where a person apparently shifts from fat-burning machine to carbohydrate catastrophe in the time it takes to look at a banana. Real physiology is steadier than that. The body passes through overlapping phases, not moral states. So for now, in these early hours, you're still under the influence of recent abundance. The bloodstream carries the evidence of that meal. The digestive tract is still busy with its organized dismantling. Hormones remain in conversation. The liver is stocking shelves. The muscles are accepting what they need. Fat tissue is, for the moment, under instructions not to release much of its own stored energy, because outside fuel is still coming through the door. Hunger has quieted. The body has work to do, and it prefers to do it without interruption. But this fullness does not last forever, and the chemistry of being fed is, by design, temporary. Stomach contents move onward, nutrient absorption begins to taper, insulin slowly recedes, and the body starts preparing for the next long stretch by turning its attention away from what is arriving and toward what has already been stored. Somewhere a few hours ahead, the warmth of that meal will begin to fade into something lighter, emptier, and more observant. Now the obvious drama of the meal has passed. The plate is empty or nearly so, the digestive tract is still busy, and for a while the body remains comfortably within the fed state. But this is the stretch where fullness stops feeling like an event and starts becoming a memory. Not a distant one, certainly, but one that is no longer dominating the room. A few hours after eating, especially if that one meal was large, most people are no longer thinking with any seriousness that they could never eat again. The body has moved on from immediate intake and is beginning the quieter work of sorting out what was useful, what was surplus, and what should happen next. This period is easy to overlook because nothing about it feels especially cinematic. There is no dramatic hormonal fanfare. No internal announcer steps forward to declare that phase 2 of the one-meal day has officially begun. But a good deal is changing. The stomach is less distended than it was shortly after the meal. Gastric emptying has continued. The small intestine is still absorbing nutrients, though the pace may be slowing depending on what was eaten. Blood glucose, if it rose sharply, may now be coming back down toward baseline. Insulin, which increased to help manage incoming fuel, is beginning to ease. Satiety signals are still present, but they are not quite as persuasive as they were an hour or two ago. Fullness has not vanished. It has simply stopped being absolute. That soft decline in fullness is one of the more interesting features of the one-meal pattern, because it reveals how temporary satiety really is. We often speak as though fullness were a switch. You are hungry, then you are full, then later you are hungry again. In reality, it behaves more like a fading broadcast. At first, the signal is strong and unmistakable. The stomach is stretched, the gut hormones are active, the brain is informed in no uncertain terms that eating has taken place. Then gradually the volume comes down. The message is still there, but it no longer drowns out everything else. You can go about your day, you can think about other things. Food cues become a little more noticeable again. You're not hungry yet, not exactly, but you're no longer protected by that invincible post-meal certainty that made another plate seem completely unreasonable. In the 3 to 5 hour range after eating, many people are still using a good deal of the meal's incoming energy. Glucose from digestible carbohydrates may still be circulating, or may already have been handled, depending on the meal. The liver has stored glycogen. Muscles have taken in glucose if needed. Amino acids from protein have been distributed and used for protein synthesis, repair, enzyme production, and various other jobs that never pause just because you are not currently eating. Dietary fat is still being processed and transported. The body, in other words, is not suddenly empty. It is still very much dealing with recent abundance, but it is dealing with it in a more organised, less theatrical way. One thing worth noticing here is that the body prefers transitions to be smooth. Homeostasis is largely the art of making changes without letting them feel like emergencies. So when blood glucose begins to come down after a meal, the body does not, in a healthy situation, let it plunge dramatically just to make the point. Insulin decreases as less incoming glucose needs managing. The liver becomes more active in helping maintain blood sugar within a workable range. Glycogen can be broken down as needed to release glucose into the blood. This is a normal handoff. The body is moving from relying mainly on newly absorbed nutrients to relying a bit more on stored ones, but it tries to make that exchange quiet enough that you barely notice. Whether you do notice depends on many things. Meal size is the obvious one. A very large meal can leave a person satisfied for quite a long time, though not always in a pleasant way. Sometimes that satisfaction is stable and easy. Sometimes it is merely the after effect of having eaten enough for a family gathering and then expecting your digestive tract to behave as though nothing remarkable has happened. A smaller meal, even if it is the only one of the day, may leave the body less buffered. Composition matters just as much. Protein and fibre tend to support satiety. Fat often prolongs stomach emptying and can make the fading of fullness more gradual. Highly refined carbohydrates, particularly if eaten without much protein or fibre, can give fullness a shorter contract. You may feel fed, then quite suddenly less so, as though the meal has stepped out of the room without saying goodbye. This is also where appetite begins separating itself from simple, stomach volume. Immediately after eating, the stomach's physical fullness does a lot of the work. A few hours later, that mechanical fullness matters less, and other signals become more important. Blood nutrient levels, gut hormones, learned meal timing, stress, sleep, activity, and even boredom all begin voting again. The body may still have energy available, but the feeling of having recently eaten is becoming less vivid. That is a subtle but meaningful change. It is possible to be metabolically well supplied and subjectively more interested in food, because appetite is not just a fuel gauge, it is also a timing system, a memory system, a reward system, and occasionally a nuisance. Consider the person who has eaten a large midday meal and then spends the afternoon working at a desk. If the meal was balanced and substantial, they may feel steady for several hours. Their blood sugar is regulated, their digestive tract continues its work, and their brain is not yet sending strong food-seeking signals. But now imagine that same person walking past a cafe around their usual snack time. Suddenly the body's experience is not just how much energy do we have, but also, is this one of those familiar moments when we usually eat something buttery? Habit has entered the chat. The sight and smell of food can bring appetite forward, even when the metabolic situation is reasonably calm. This does not mean the hunger is fake. It means hunger has more than one source, and the one meal day is particularly good at exposing that fact. Meanwhile, the hormonal landscape is shifting by degrees. Ghrelin, which tends to rise before habitual meal times and fall after eating, may have dropped after the meal, but it does not stay quietly in the basement forever. It works in patterns, not permanent rulings. If the body is accustomed to several meals a day, ghrelin may begin nudging appetite upward at times it expects food, even if a person is trying a one-meal schedule. This is one reason the first week or two of such eating patterns can feel harder than later weeks. The body learns routine, and hunger often follows routine with an almost bureaucratic commitment. It may complain at noon, not because catastrophe is near, but because noon has historically been a time when sandwiches were involved. The brain, for its part, is not simply waiting for glucose numbers to cross a threshold before it changes mood. It is integrating many inputs. Are nutrients still arriving from the gut? Is insulin falling? Are familiar meal cues appearing? Is stress high? Was sleep poor the night before? Was the last meal adequate in protein and energy? The brain cares about all of this because it is expensive tissue, metabolically speaking. It wants a stable fuel supply, and it is very willing to influence your thoughts in order to protect one. Sometimes that influence is gentle. You notice food smells more. You become aware that dinner advertisements are suddenly persuasive in a way that feels faintly insulting. Other times, it is less subtle. Concentration drifts. Irritability grows teeth. The mind develops very strong opinions about crackers, and yet, in a healthy person a few hours after eating, this is usually not the hour of crisis. It is the hour of transition. The meal is no longer at center stage, but the body has not reached a point of true scarcity. Liver glycogen is available, blood glucose is being maintained. Fatty acids are beginning to play a larger background role as insulin continues to fall and stored fuel becomes more accessible. The body is changing source, not failing. That distinction matters. Modern language around food often treats the first sign of returning appetite as though it were proof of emergency. It usually is not. It is information. A reminder that the fed state is temporary and that biology likes continuity, not endless feasting. There is a small psychological trick hidden in this part of the day. Once fullness starts fading, time itself can feel different. Immediately after a meal, especially a large one, the next eating occasion seems remote. 4 hours later, it no longer feels remote. The body has not suddenly burned through the whole meal in a fit of metabolic extravagance. Rather, the certainty of being fed has worn off. This can make the afternoon or evening feel longer in a one-meal pattern. When food is not scheduled to appear again, every familiar food-related moment becomes more noticeable. Coffee breaks, family dinners, co-workers unwrapping things with suspiciously cheerful crinkling sounds, all of it stands out more once satiety softens. It is here that meal quality starts showing its hand. Suppose the meal contained generous protein, some intact carbohydrates, fats, and fibre. The decline in fullness is likely to be slower, and blood sugar regulation may be steadier. The body has materials to work with, and appetite may return with relative patience. Now picture a one-meal intake that was large in calories but poor in structure. Sweet drinks, refined starches, little fibre, not much protein. Such a meal can create a different arc. A person may feel quite full at first, then somewhat hollow sooner than expected, as if the body has been given energy but not much reassurance. Satiety is not simply about calories. It is about how convincingly the meal tells the body that nourishment has occurred. There is also the issue of digestion as workload. Several hours after a large meal, the digestive system may still be very occupied. Some people feel contented by that, almost grounded. Others feel heavy, sluggish, or too aware of their abdomen, which is never the most elegant form of self-awareness. When eating once a day, this workload becomes concentrated. Instead of spreading digestive effort across multiple meals, much of it is gathered into one longer post-meal period. For some people, this suits them perfectly. For others, it creates an odd rhythm where part of the day feels overfed and the latter half underfed. The body can adapt to many things, but not every schedule feels equally natural to every digestive tract. By this point, the liver deserves another polite round of appreciation. It is central to keeping the transition smooth. After a meal, it stores glycogen. As absorbed nutrients taper off, it can begin releasing glucose from those glycogen stores to keep blood sugar stable. Later, if fasting continues longer, it will increase glucose production through gluconeogenesis and help manage the shift toward greater fat use and ketone production. But in these early post-fed hours, glycogen is the main bridge. You might think of it as the body's short-term pantry, stocked during the meal and quietly open later so the rest of the system does not have to experience every pause in incoming food as a crisis. It is not vast, but it is very useful, especially over the first half of a fasting window. Muscle glycogen, by contrast, is a little more selfish. It stores carbohydrate for the muscle's own use, especially during activity, and does not simply donate glucose to the bloodstream whenever the liver asks nicely. This is why exercise can change the experience of once-a-day eating. A physically active person, especially one training hard, may move through these transitions differently. They may refill glycogen less completely with one meal, or deplete it more rapidly, or simply feel the lack of repeated intake sooner. The body can still adapt, but the hour-by-hour experience becomes more demanding. A person spending the afternoon answering emails and a person spending it carrying lumber upstairs are not having quite the same conversation with their metabolism. Hydration and electrolytes can also influence this middle stretch more than people expect. What looks like hunger is sometimes partly thirst, partly low sodium, or partly the slightly flattened feeling that follows a long gap without both fluid and food. A one-meal day that includes very little salt, especially in someone active or sweating a great deal, can produce a vague sense of depletion that is not purely caloric. The body is not a steam engine running on a single fuel. It is a chemical environment, and that environment needs more than energy alone to feel steady. Then there is the matter of attention. When you are busy, the slow fading of fullness may pass almost unnoticed. The day moves, tasks absorb you, and only later do you realize that the body has shifted significantly since the meal. But in a quiet setting, especially if food is on your mind, every stage can feel magnified. This is one reason people often report very different experiences with the same eating pattern depending on context. An occupied day can make a fasting window feel shorter. A reflective evening spent thinking about what you're not eating can make 3 hours feel like a small century. Human metabolism unfolds in tissue, but human eating always unfolds in time, habit, mood, and environment as well. Around this point, the body is also becoming a little less insulated from external temptations. A smell that would have seemed irrelevant right after the meal may now be intriguing. The idea of dessert, once laughable, becomes plausible. This does not necessarily mean energy is low. It means the appetite system is re-entering the discussion. Food is moving from biologically unnecessary to increasingly attractive. That is a very important shift in a one-meal pattern, because it is the bridge between satiety and the first true return of hunger. Of course, the body does not treat all tissues equally during this transition. The brain remains a priority. Red blood cells, which rely on glucose, remain a priority. The liver works to protect blood glucose. Hormones adjust accordingly. As insulin comes down, the suppression of fat release eases, allowing adipose tissue to contribute more fatty acids to circulation. Many tissues can use these fatty acids directly, which helps spare glucose for tissues that need it more urgently. This is a normal and elegant arrangement. It is one of the body's favourite tricks. Shift some systems onto one fuel source so that others can keep their preferred allotment. The person experiencing this may simply say, "I'm less full now." Inside, a careful redistribution is underway. That redistribution is one reason the fading of fullness does not immediately become weakness. You're not running out all at once. You're moving on to a broader mix of fuel sources. The body likes mixed strategies. In the earlier fed period, incoming nutrients did most of the obvious work. Now stored carbohydrate and increasing access to fat take on more of the load. If the one daily meal was sufficient, this can feel quite stable for a while. Some people even report a sense of improved alertness once the heavy post-meal feeling wears off. Digestion becomes less dominant, insulin is lower than it was, and the mind feels less foggy. Others feel the opposite, especially if the meal was unbalanced or too small. Biology offers patterns, not guarantees. This is also when a curious kind of confidence can set in. The person practicing one meal a day may notice that they are several hours removed from food and still perfectly functional. That can feel surprising at first, because modern meal culture often implies that every few hours without eating is a dangerous flirtation with collapse. For most healthy adults, it is not. It is simply a change in metabolic sourcing. The body is doing what bodies are designed to do between meals, only for longer. There is something almost reassuring in this. You discover that the machinery is more capable than advertising would have you believe. It is not thrilled by neglect, perhaps, but it is admirably competent in the gap. Still, this competence has its limits, and the body does not intend to remain politely unconcerned forever. The fading of fullness is only the beginning of a longer transition. As the hours continue, gut-derived satiety signals quiet further, blood nutrients from the meal dwindle, and the familiar first wave of hunger begins preparing its entrance. It does not usually arrive as a grand emergency siren. More often it begins as a thought, a tug, a little increase in interest, the sense that food has moved from background concept to relevant subject again. And once that shift starts, the brain becomes much harder to distract, with noble ideas about dietary discipline, and much easier to persuade with the smell of bread from another room. And now the body begins to notice in a more deliberate way that no further food is arriving, not as a crisis, not as a dramatic collapse, and not with the sort of theatrical alarm that certain corners of the wellness industry seem to enjoy, but with a measured shift in tension. This is often the first real hunger wave, the point where satiety has faded enough for appetite to become an active presence again. A few hours ago, food was still the dominant fact inside your body. Nutrients were arriving, the gut was busy, insulin was elevated, and the whole system was occupied with processing what had just been eaten. Now that influence has softened. The meal is no longer happening, it has happened. And the brain, which has been monitoring the entire arrangement with quiet professional interest, starts adjusting its priorities accordingly. This is where people often say, very simply, "I'm getting hungry." It sounds obvious, perhaps insultingly obvious. But that feeling is not a single event, it is a coalition. The stomach is less full, the gut hormones that helped quiet appetite after the meal are lower than they were. Ghrelin begins to rise again, particularly if the time of day resembles one in which you normally eat. Blood glucose is being maintained, but not by the easy flood of newly absorbed carbohydrate. The liver is contributing more actively from stored glycogen. Insulin has come down enough that fat release from adipose tissue is less suppressed. Various tissues are shifting along quite capably. The brain, meanwhile, starts paying more attention to the possibility of obtaining food. What makes this first hunger wave especially interesting is that it is often as much about timing and expectation as it is about outright need. Hunger is wonderfully informative, but it is not perfectly literal. It does not always mean the body is in immediate trouble. Sometimes it means the body has learned a pattern and is now following it with admirable consistency. If you have spent years eating lunch at 1 o'clock, your brain and hormones may begin preparing for lunch before 1 o'clock arrives. Ghrelin is part of that preparation. It tends to rise in anticipation of food, which is useful when food is likely to appear and faintly annoying when it is not. This is one reason hunger can feel stronger at familiar meal times, even if you have enough stored energy to keep going quite comfortably for many more hours. The brain's role here is difficult to overstate. It is not passively observing hunger from a safe distance like a scientist behind glass. It is deeply involved in producing the experience. Several brain regions participate in appetite regulation, especially the hypothalamus, which receives signals about energy status, hormones, and nutrient availability. This small but extremely influential structure helps coordinate feeding behavior, energy expenditure, and many other basic survival functions. When signals begin to suggest that the fed state is ending, the hypothalamus does not send out a dramatic emergency bulletin. It alters the tone of your thoughts, perceptions, and motivations. Food becomes more relevant. The idea of eating gains a little weight. Attention shifts. That shift can be surprisingly subtle at first. You may not feel the classic hollow stomach sensation immediately. Instead, you might notice that other people's food starts looking more serious than it did an hour ago. The pastry in the cafe window, which previously seemed decorative, now appears to have a point. You may become aware of your own habits. Perhaps this is the time when you usually make tea and reach for something crunchy. Perhaps it is the hour when dinner advertisements begin to look less like marketing and more like prophecy. The first hunger wave often arrives through relevance before it arrives through intensity. Food moves from background category to active subject. There is also a change in reward processing. The hungry brain does not merely note the absence of food, it starts to assign more value to finding some. This makes sense from an evolutionary perspective. A brain that noticed food more strongly when energy was needed would be more likely to guide its owner toward eating at useful times. The reward system, including dopamine-related pathways, becomes more attentive to food cues when hunger rises. That does not mean dopamine is a simple hunger chemical, because it is not. Biology rarely rewards oversimplification, but it does mean that motivation and salience shift. The food you ignored earlier may now feel persuasive in a way that seems almost suspicious, as though your own nervous system has joined the advertising team. The stomach also has a contribution to make here. As it empties, it begins producing the kinds of sensations many people recognize as hunger. This can include light contractions, sometimes called migrating motor complexes, which occur between meals and help clear residual material through the digestive tract. These are not harmful, they are housekeeping, but they can feel like hunger, or at least accompany it. A person may interpret this as the stomach growling, though the sound is more a side effect of muscle activity and gas moving through a partly empty system than an emotional plea for biscuits. The body is tidying up and preparing. It simply does so with acoustics that are not always subtle. What is happening with blood sugar during this stage depends very much on the person and the meal that preceded it. In a metabolically healthy individual, blood glucose is usually still being kept within a fairly stable range. The liver is releasing glucose from glycogen to support that stability. If the previous meal was balanced and sufficient, this transition may feel smooth. But if the meal was heavy in refined carbohydrate and light on protein and fibre, some people may feel this first hunger wave more sharply, not because they have run out of energy altogether, but because the earlier glucose and insulin dynamics may have set up a less stable landing. The body can manage a great deal, but it generally prefers not to be jerked around by a sugar rush followed by a vague nutritional shrug. The first hunger wave is also where people often confuse habit, appetite, and true energetic need, because the three can overlap so neatly that they feel like one thing. You might be genuinely beginning to need another meal in the sense that your body would quite like more incoming nutrients. You might also be responding to a familiar routine. You might be tired, stressed, bored, or mildly dehydrated. All of these can sharpen awareness of food. Hunger is not less real because it has multiple sources. It is simply more complicated than the old idea of an empty tank with a single warning light. Human appetite is a dashboard full of blinking signals, some more urgent than others. One of the more useful things about a one-meal day is that it makes these layers easier to notice. When you know food is not scheduled to arrive for quite some time, you become more aware of the shape of hunger itself. It comes in waves. That part is not just a metaphor. Hunger often rises, lingers, and then recedes somewhat if it is not immediately acted on. Many people are surprised by this. They expect hunger to climb in a straight line until it becomes unbearable, like a kettle building toward a whistle. Often it behaves more like weather. A front comes through, the air changes, things feel more urgent for a while, and then the system settles. This wave-like behavior is partly hormonal, partly neural, and partly tied to the fact that the body is not static, it is adjusting continuously. This is worth dwelling on because it changes how the whole experience feels. If a person interprets the first hunger wave as proof that something is going badly wrong, the sensation tends to become more alarming. If they understand it as an expected phase in a longer fasting window, it can feel more manageable. Again, that does not mean everyone should ignore hunger heroically and stare down a bowl of pasta like a philosopher confronting temptation. It means the body is often more capable than the immediate sensation suggests. The first hunger wave is frequently an announcement, not a catastrophe. Of course, capability has limits. Someone with diabetes, someone on particular medications, someone with a history of disordered eating, or someone doing heavy physical labour may not experience this stage in the same mild, educational way. Their physiology and risks are different. But for a generally healthy adult experimenting with one meal a day, the first hunger wave often tells an interesting story about the brain's relationship to expectation. The body has not failed, it has simply begun to lobby. Stress can make that lobbying much louder. Cortisol, the hormone most people know as the one blamed for absolutely everything from belly fat to bad emails, does play a role here, though not in the cartoonish way it is often portrayed. It helps regulate energy availability and participates in maintaining blood glucose, especially during fasting or other demands. If stress is high, appetite can become more complicated. Some people lose it. Others become much more food-focused. The brain under stress tends to prefer certainty and easy reward, and food is an ancient, efficient form of both. So a person in a calm afternoon may feel a gentle first hunger wave, while the same person in a tense, sleep-deprived, overworked afternoon may feel as though their entire consciousness has been reduced to thoughts of bread. Sleep deprivation deserves its own quiet warning here, because it changes hunger in ways that feel deeply unfair. Short sleep tends to alter appetite-regulating hormones and increase food reward. People often feel hungrier, especially for energy-dense foods, after poor sleep. So if someone attempts a one-meal pattern while sleeping badly, the first hunger wave may arrive earlier, hit harder, and bring along a surprisingly convincing argument for pastries. This is not weakness. It is the brain trying to secure energy under conditions it interprets as less than ideal. The body is always reasoning, even when the reasoning results in you standing in the kitchen staring at peanut butter with unusual sincerity. There is something else the brain starts to notice during this phase, and that is opportunity cost. When food is not immediately available, attention can become more fragmented. Some people report a slight sharpening at first as insulin is lower and digestion is no longer dominating blood flow and comfort. Others report the opposite: mild distraction, shorter patience, a bit of mental static. Both can happen. The difference often depends on what came before. A very large meal may have caused sluggishness that now lifts. A too small meal may have left the body undersupplied. One person's alert fasted state is another person's slightly irritable spreadsheet session. That irritability is not merely personality under pressure. The brain is an expensive organ. It cares a great deal about stable energy delivery, and when food cues become more salient, emotional tone can change. Hunger has a way of trimming patience to the legal minimum. The popular idea of being hangry survives because it corresponds to a real experience, though the biology behind it is more subtle than a simple low-glucose tantrum. Expectations, stress, habits, and reward circuitry all contribute. Still, the first hunger wave can make the world feel fractionally less charming. Delays are more annoying. Other people's cheerful chewing is less admirable. Minor inconveniences suddenly seem to have been arranged on purpose. At the same time, the body is increasingly leaning on stored fuels in a perfectly ordinary way. Liver glycogen is still the main short-term support for blood glucose in this stretch, though its exact availability depends on how much was stored and how active the person has been. Fatty acids released from adipose tissue are becoming more useful to tissues that can burn them directly. This helps preserve glucose for the brain and red blood cells. So while the brain begins noticing hunger, many parts of the body are actually handling the shift with reasonable competence. It is not that all systems are struggling, it is that the system responsible for motivation is becoming more interested in ensuring future supply. That difference between motivation and immediate deficit is one of the most important ideas in the whole one-meal discussion. The body often starts wanting food before it is anywhere near empty. This is sensible. Survival favours anticipation, not last-minute panic. If ancient humans only felt motivated to seek food once reserves were nearly exhausted, they would have had a very poor time of it. Better to notice early, search early, and avoid needless risk. Modern hunger still carries that anticipatory logic, which is why the first hunger wave can feel quite insistent, even while the body remains metabolically stable. Some people discover at this stage that the feeling passes more easily than expected. They get up, walk around, drink water, continue working, and 20 minutes later the urgency is eased. Others find that once the hunger wave begins, it stalks them politely but persistently for the rest of the afternoon. The variability is real. Meal composition, prior adaptation to fasting, stress level, sleep, activity, insulin sensitivity, and even the social environment all matter. If everyone around you is eating, the brain notices. Humans are very social eaters. A meal in front of you is not just a fuel source, it is also an invitation, a cue, a tiny cultural ceremony. Ignoring that repeatedly takes more neural effort than people sometimes admit. There is also a practical issue of protein distribution that starts to matter here, though its consequences are not felt as a dramatic sensation in the moment. If a person eats only once, they have only one major opportunity to provide amino acids for muscle protein synthesis and general repair. The body can adapt to longer fasting windows, but protein handling still has limits. So even if the first hunger wave is manageable from an energy perspective, the broader pattern may not be ideal for every goal, especially if someone is trying to gain or maintain muscle. This is the sort of detail metabolism likes to hide under the floorboards while popular discussion shouts about insulin. The body is always dealing not just with calories but with timing, supply, repair and trade-offs. Around this point, the inner conversation often becomes noticeably psychological. Could I eat? Becomes should I eat? And sometimes, why is everyone suddenly mentioning snacks? The first hunger wave is rarely pure physiology. It arrives in the context of memory, habit, schedule, and personal rules. If a person has decided that they are eating once a day, The first hunger wave is the first real test of that rule. Not because the body is failing, but because the brain has started to propose alternatives. It is one thing to enjoy the idea of a structured fasting window at the end of a satisfying meal. It is another to maintain that enthusiasm 6 hours later when someone opens a box of warm food nearby. Still, the body usually continues on. Hunger rises, attention shifts, the reward value of food increases, the stomach may grumble, the mind may become a little more interested in recipes than is professionally necessary. Yet under the surface, the system is not chaotic. It is becoming more fasted, yes, but it is doing so through organised transitions. Glycogen is still there, fatty acid use is increasing, hormones are adjusting. The brain is beginning to notice with more urgency, but not yet with panic. This is the stretch where appetite becomes unmistakable without becoming overwhelming for most healthy people. And perhaps that is the strangest thing about it. The first hunger wave feels important, but it is rarely the whole story. It is only the beginning of a longer negotiation. The body has announced that the fed state is over. The brain has begun to take food more seriously again. The day, if you're eating once, is entering its more demanding half. And as the hours continue, the question shifts from, do I feel less full now, to something more pointed and much harder to ignore, because soon the body is no longer simply noticing the absence of food. It is starting to settle into the long stretch where snacks do not arrive, lunch is no longer a possibility, and the afternoon begins to test how gracefully your metabolism can mind its own business. By now, the day has entered that particularly revealing stretch in which eating once a day stops being an idea and becomes an atmosphere. The first clear wave of hunger has already introduced itself. The body has noticed that no further meal is arriving. The brain has begun to take food more seriously again, and yet the hours keep moving. Work continues, messages arrive, light shifts outside the window. Other people begin eating things in your general vicinity with a casual confidence that can seem, under the circumstances, almost provocative. This is the long afternoon without snacks, and it has a way of showing you exactly how much of modern eating is built from habit, opportunity, social timing, and the simple fact that food is usually never very far away. What makes this part of the day so distinctive is that it is not usually dramatic enough to count as suffering, but it is no longer easy enough to forget. The body is no longer coasting on the psychological certainty of recent fullness. Hunger is not a passing suggestion now. It is a recurring theme, not overwhelming in every case, not necessarily unpleasant all the time, but present. You may find that it comes in pulses. It sharpens, then eases, then returns. A glass of water may help for a while. Distraction may help. A walk may help. Then, perhaps an hour later, the appetite returns with renewed interest, as though it has checked your schedule and discovered, with some irritation, that you're still not planning to produce a meal. Metabolically, the body is continuing its gradual handover from recent intake to stored resources. The nutrients absorbed directly from that one meal are no longer the main event. The digestive system may still be finishing certain tasks, especially if the meal was large, rich in fat, or heavy in protein and fibre, but the easy abundance of the fed state is over. Blood glucose is being maintained increasingly by the liver, which is breaking down glycogen to release glucose into circulation. Insulin is lower now than it was after the meal, which matters because lower insulin allows adipose tissue, body fat, to release more fatty acids into the bloodstream. Many tissues can use those fatty acids directly. The brain cannot rely on them in the same way, but muscles and other organs can. The system is, in other words, doing what it was designed to do between meals. The difference is that between meals has become much longer than usual. This is where one of the central misunderstandings about hunger becomes obvious. People often speak as though feeling hungry automatically means the body is running out of usable energy in some simple, immediate way. But during the long afternoon without snacks, most healthy adults still have plenty of fuel available inside them. What they do not have is incoming fuel, and that distinction changes the experience enormously. The body can access stored energy, but the brain still treats the absence of new food as important information. It shifts attention, increases food salience, and makes eating feel more relevant. Hunger is partly about supply, yes, but it is also about prompting behaviour before supply becomes a problem. It is anticipatory. It is persuasive. It is, from an evolutionary point of view, trying to save you from being too relaxed about resource management. That evolutionary logic is not always convenient in a modern office, kitchen, or family home. Ancient foragers did not, so far as we know, have co-workers opening packets of crisps 6 feet away, or relatives asking whether they are sure they do not want a little something. They also did not have an entire economy built around making food visible, fragrant, portable, and available at nearly every moment of mild emotional fluctuation. The long afternoon without snacks is therefore not merely a metabolic condition, it is a perceptual one. The brain begins spotting food with a dedication that would be admirable in a search and rescue dog. The biscuit tin is suddenly not just a container, it is a possibility. The cafe you barely registered in the morning has become a morally complex landmark. Hunger changes what stands out. There is a good reason for that. The reward value of food increases as the fasting window lengthens. Food cues become more motivating, taste is anticipated more vividly. A person does not simply think in an abstract way that eating might be pleasant. The nervous system gives that possibility a little more emotional brightness. This is why the thought of a simple sandwich can become oddly moving by late afternoon. It is not that the sandwich has objectively improved, it is that the brain has updated its priorities. Hunger edits the world. It does not create food out of nowhere, sadly, but it does highlight it with increasing enthusiasm. Still, the body is not sitting idly by waiting for you to crack. Hormones and fuel systems continue to adapt. Ghrelin may rise around habitual meal times, which can make certain hours feel particularly pointed. If you usually snack in the afternoon, that old rhythm can echo here even if your actual energy stores are adequate. The body is fond of routine. It learns patterns and then predicts them. Break the pattern, and the learned signals do not vanish immediately. They knock politely at first, then more firmly, as if to say that this is normally the hour when something with salt or sugar appears, and frankly, the departure from tradition has not gone unnoticed. That feeling often unsettles people the first time they try a one-meal pattern. They assume the hunger means their body is malfunctioning, or that their blood sugar must be in ruins. In many cases, neither is true. The body is simply in a sustained fasting period, relying on stored fuels and reminding the brain that eating would be useful at some point. It helps to remember that a great deal of normal physiology was built to bridge gaps between meals. Glycogen in the liver exists for precisely this reason. Adipose tissue exists for precisely this reason. Hormonal flexibility exists for precisely this reason. Human metabolism is not an on-demand food processor that becomes helpless every time lunch is delayed. It is a storage and release system with a surprisingly competent backup plan. That said, competent does not always feel comfortable. There is often a dull edge to the afternoon when no snacks are coming. Some people describe it as lightness, some as emptiness, some as an irritability that is not strong enough to justify itself, but far too persistent to ignore. The stomach may feel quiet one moment, and then unexpectedly vocal the next. Thoughts may drift toward food without permission. Concentration may become more brittle. This is where individual differences matter a great deal. Someone well adapted to longer fasting windows may feel steady, alert, even faintly pleased with themselves. Someone new to the pattern may feel trapped in a long, low negotiation with their own kitchen. A good deal depends on what the body is being asked to do during this stretch. Quiet desk work is one thing. A physically demanding job is another. Exercise adds another layer again. Muscles can burn fatty acids quite happily at rest and during some lower intensity activity, but high intensity effort depends more heavily on glycogen. If a person has eaten once, many hours ago, and now asks their body for a hard training session, the experience may be very different from sitting in a chair answering emails while thinking honourable thoughts about self-discipline. Energy availability is not just about total fuel in the body. It is about whether the right fuel is accessible at the right time for the right task. This helps explain why some people thrive on once-a-day eating in ordinary sedentary life, but find it much less charming when training seriously. The long afternoon without snacks can feel manageable when the body's demands are modest. Add intervals, heavy lifting, long-distance running, or physical labour, and the polite hum of fasting may become a louder complaint. The liver can only release glycogen so fast. Muscle glycogen is stored locally and used according to demand. Fat oxidation rises, yes, but it does not solve every energetic need with equal elegance. Biology is adaptable, but it still likes suitable timing. Mood also becomes more revealing in this part of the day. Hunger does not create personality from scratch, but it does shave away some of the buffer. People often become a little more reactive, a little less patient, a little less willing to find their fellow humans enchanting. This is not because the body is in dramatic danger. It is because the brain is trying to balance ongoing tasks with the increasingly relevant issue of future fuel. When food becomes salient, it takes up mental real estate. Some of your attention remains with work or conversation or whatever the afternoon requires. Some of it begins circling the very old question of when you will next eat. The result can feel like mild cognitive background noise. There is also a distinct sensory change that sometimes appears here. Food smells stronger. Not necessarily because the kitchen has launched an attack, but because the brain has become more interested in olfactory cues that might predict nourishment. Appetite heightens awareness. A person who barely noticed someone reheating leftovers at noon may find by late afternoon that the same room smells like a complete menu. It is one of the less glamorous but more persuasive powers of hunger. The environment itself starts cooperating with the appetite system. At the same time, not all signals are equally trustworthy. Fatigue, dehydration, stress, boredom, and even simple restlessness can all masquerade as hunger or amplify it. The long afternoon often contains at least one moment where a person thinks they are desperately hungry, and then realizes, after standing up or drinking something or stepping outdoors for 5 minutes, that the urgency has altered. This does not mean the original hunger was imaginary. It means the body and brain were stacking several sensations on top of each other. Once-a-day eating can make that stacking easier to observe because you're not smoothing over every sensation with another snack. That observation is one of the more educational parts of the experience. You start noticing how often appetite arrives attached to context. There is the meeting-ending appetite, the boredom appetite, the walking past a bakery appetite, the everyone else is having coffee and something small appetite. There is the genuine physical hunger underneath them, certainly, but the afternoon reveals just how social and situational eating really is. In an ordinary day with multiple eating opportunities, those cues blend seamlessly into behaviour. In a one-meal day, they become more visible because they are repeatedly denied a response. The brain says here would normally be a good place for a snack. The body says yes, noted, and then nothing happens. That silence is strangely informative. By this point, the hormonal environment is increasingly suited to fasting. Lower insulin means greater lipolysis, which is the release of stored fat from adipose tissue into the bloodstream. Fat cells, those often maligned and deeply practical savings accounts, begin contributing more actively to the day's energy economy. Fatty acids circulate and are taken up by tissues able to use them. The liver continues balancing blood glucose, drawing on glycogen and, as fasting extends further, beginning to increase other supportive processes. This is not yet the dramatic late fasting state people like to describe with reverent talk of metabolic transformation, but it is a real shift. The body is leaning more decisively on its own reserves. This matters because it explains why many people can function reasonably well through the afternoon even while feeling hungry. The sensation of wanting food and the capacity to continue are not opposites. They often coexist. You can be hungry and metabolically supported. You can be food-focused and still physically capable. You can even feel a strange combination of mild deprivation and decent energy, which sounds contradictory until you remember that the brain's job is partly to motivate behaviour before genuine depletion becomes severe. The body's paying its current bills from savings, while politely reminding you that income would still be appreciated. For some people, there is a period in the later part of the afternoon where hunger levels off rather than rising indefinitely. This can feel surprising. They expect things to worsen steadily, but instead the wave stabilises. A certain clarity may return. The body has settled more fully into the fasting state. Fatty acid availability is higher, digestive heaviness is gone, blood sugar is still being regulated. The mind may become calmer than it was during the first hunger wave, when appetite first made its formal complaint. This is one reason some people become enthusiastic about fasting. They discover that the middle of the fast feels more manageable than the beginning, and they interpret that as a kind of secret knowledge. In reality, it is simply adaptation. The body has moved from transition into a more established pattern. Others do not get that pleasant steadiness at all. They remain distracted, cold, preoccupied, or low in energy. Again, this is where all the practical details matter. Was the meal large enough? Did it contain enough protein, enough minerals, enough overall energy? Is the person sleeping well? Are they stressed? Are they carrying a lot of lean mass and doing hard training? Are they taking medication that changes glucose handling or appetite? No single fasting pattern answers all these variables. Human beings are not identical enough for that, however inconvenient it may be for people selling certainty online. Social life becomes particularly awkward here. The late afternoon and early evening are built around small food events in many cultures. A coffee with something sweet, a shared snack, family members beginning dinner preparations, colleagues discussing what to order. Once a day eating asks you to stand inside all of those rituals without participating, unless your one meal happens to be timed right in the middle of them. That is not purely psychological decoration. Meals anchor time. They divide the day. They create pauses and transitions. Remove the snack and the afternoon can feel less punctuated, more stretched, a little flatter in shape. Some people enjoy that efficiency. Others feel that the day loses one of its softer edges. The body, meanwhile, continues to care about sodium, potassium, fluids, and overall comfort. A long gap without food can sometimes produce a vague, washed-out feeling that is not entirely about calories. Especially in active people or hot environments, electrolytes matter, so does hydration. It is one of the many reasons fasting experiences differ so much. Two people can go the same number of hours without food and report completely different states because one is hydrated and calm and sitting indoors, while the other is underslept, stressed and running errands in summer heat. Metabolism does not occur in a vacuum. It occurs in a person having a day. There is also the question of body temperature. Some people notice they feel colder during long fasting windows. This can happen for several reasons, including lower thermic effect from the absence of repeated meals, changes in circulation, and the general fact that digestion itself generates warmth. When you're no longer regularly feeding the furnace, so to speak, the house can feel slightly less cozy. It is not universal, but it is common enough to mention. The long afternoon without snacks can have a faintly wintry quality even when the weather is not cooperating. Cognitively, the picture remains mixed. Some individuals report excellent focus once they are well into the fast, especially if they are accustomed to it. Others become increasingly distracted. Both are plausible. Heavy digestion is no longer competing for comfort, insulin is lower, and a certain crispness can emerge for some brains. But hunger, food salience, and mild irritability can easily offset that advantage in others. The body offers no universal performance guarantee. It offers trade-offs. One person gets calm mental clarity. Another gets a detailed fantasy involving bread, soup, and a chair near a window. What is certain is that this stretch reveals the difference between eating because it is time and eating because a meal has actually arrived. The clock matters, habit matters, social cues matter. The body is not just a chemistry set reacting to nutrients. It is a predictive system living in a world full of patterns. The afternoon is where that predictive nature becomes difficult to ignore. Every familiar food hour that passes without food teaches the system something, or at least gives it the opportunity to learn. Ghrelin patterns may shift over time. Appetite may become less noisy at certain hours. The body can adapt, though not always completely and not always comfortably. Yet adaptation is exactly what it is trying to do now. It is balancing blood glucose, mobilizing stored fat, conserving what needs conserving, encouraging you with moderate persistence to remember that food remains an excellent idea. The long afternoon is not the body failing, it is the body bridging. A bridge can be elegant and still slightly windy. You are not in the easy certainty of the fed state anymore, but you are not yet at the deeper metabolic stretch that comes later either. You're in the middle distance, where the snack would normally appear, where habit is strongest, where the brain is repeatedly checking the horizon and finding it stubbornly meal-free. And as that horizon continues to remain empty, another shift begins preparing itself in the background. The liver's short-term support cannot remain the whole story forever. Glycogen stores continue to be drawn upon. Fatty acids keep circulating. Hormones keep adjusting. The body grows less interested in pretending this is merely a delayed coffee break, and more interested in settling into the longer overnight machinery it has used for most of human history. Which is why, after enough of these hours, the mood of the fast changes again, and what began as a long afternoon without snacks starts turning into something quieter, older, and metabolically far more committed. And so the afternoon continues, and somewhere in the background, without fuss and without a great flashing sign over the abdomen, stored sugar begins doing the kind of useful, competent work for which it was saved in the first place. This is the moment when glycogen, particularly glycogen in the liver, moves from supporting role to lead performer. The meal is far enough behind you now that incoming carbohydrate is no longer carrying the day on its own. The body has already sorted what it could use immediately, packed some away, and now starts opening those short-term reserves with the calm efficiency of someone reaching into a pantry rather than a person throwing themselves at emergency supplies. Glycogen is simply stored carbohydrate, but the simplicity of that description hides how clever the arrangement really is. Glucose is wonderfully useful, especially for tissues that depend heavily on it, but having it all float freely in the bloodstream would be neither practical nor safe. So the body stores some of it in a compact form, linked together into glycogen, mainly in the liver and muscles. The muscles keep their glycogen largely for themselves, which is very on brand for muscle tissue. The liver, by contrast, behaves more like a public service. It stores glucose after a meal and then releases it back into the bloodstream later, helping maintain blood sugar between meals and especially during longer gaps like this one. If the one-meal day has a quiet hero in the middle hours, it is often the liver, working away without fanfare while the brain busies itself thinking about toast. What makes this stage important is that it marks a genuine change in where stability is coming from. Earlier, just after the meal, blood glucose could be supported directly by what was being absorbed from the intestine. Insulin rose in response, tissues took up nutrients, and the body behaved with the easy confidence of recent abundance. Now that direct stream has slowed dramatically. Yet blood sugar does not simply fall away into chaos. In a healthy person, it is held within a fairly narrow range, because the body cares very deeply about not letting its most important systems become erratic. The brain may be flexible in many respects, but it is not especially fond of unpredictable fuel delivery. Red blood cells too rely on glucose, so the liver steps in more decisively, breaking glycogen down into glucose and releasing it as needed. This process is called glycogenolysis, which sounds like a 19th century digestive tonic, but is in fact one of the most practical things your body ever does. The timing of this shift depends on the size and content of the meal, your activity level, your insulin sensitivity, and the general state of your metabolism. But in broad terms, several hours into a once-a-day pattern, liver glycogen becomes increasingly central. You can think of it as the body's short-range bridge fuel. It is not the deep long-term reserve that would be body fat, but it is not the fleeting sugar from the meal either. It sits in the useful middle, quick enough to access, organised enough to regulate, and dependable enough to keep things running while the fast lengthens. A well-run household does not live only from groceries just brought in, or from canned goods in the attic. It also has the everyday cupboard. Glycogen is very much the everyday cupboard. This is one of the reasons the first part of fasting is often easier metabolically than people imagine. The body is not leaping from full meal to profound deprivation in a single bound. It is walking across a sequence of supports. First recent absorption, then liver glycogen, then greater reliance on fat, and later still, a more pronounced role for ketones and glucose production from non-carbohydrate sources. The transitions overlap. They do not snap shut behind you like trapdoors, which is fortunate because most of us have enough to do in the afternoon without our metabolism staging melodrama. The hormonal environment shifts to support this stage. Insulin is lower than it was after the meal, which matters because high insulin suppresses glycogen breakdown and fat release. As insulin comes down, glucagon becomes relatively more influential. Glucagon is produced by the pancreas and often described as insulin's counterpart, though that can make them sound like rival detectives in a metabolic crime drama. In reality, they are part of a coordinated system. When blood glucose needs support, glucagon helps signal the liver to break down glycogen and release glucose. It is one of the body's polite but firm ways of saying, "Could we please put some sugar back into circulation now?" Adrenaline and cortisol can also support this process under certain conditions, particularly if stress or physical demand is involved, but glucagon is the most straightforward player in the ordinary fasting afternoon. Now, if your one daily meal was rich in carbohydrates, particularly starchy or sugary ones, liver glycogen stores may have been refilled more generously. In that case, this stage can feel relatively smooth. The body has a good amount in reserve, and the liver can maintain blood glucose without much strain. If the meal was lower in carbohydrate, the glycogen stores may be more modest, and the body may begin leaning on other fuels sooner. Neither pattern is automatically better or worse in every case. They simply create different internal pacing. Some people like the steadiness that comes with replenished glycogen. Others prefer the earlier shift toward fat use, and find they feel mentally clearer once that transition is underway. The body, for its part, is mostly interested in whether the current plan is workable. What does workable feel like? Often it feels less dramatic than you might expect. This is not usually the stage where a healthy adult suddenly becomes weak at the knees because lunch was missed. More often, it is a strange combination of decent functionality and growing awareness. You can still think, walk, work, answer messages, remember where you put your keys, and perhaps even remain civil to other people. At the same time, food remains increasingly relevant. This is the odd feature of glycogen-supported fasting. The body is still maintaining fuel well enough, but the brain is not willing to let the topic of future eating drift entirely out of view. So the body is stable while the mind grows more interested. You're supported and persuaded at once. That persuasion can be confusing because glycogen does its work quietly. You do not feel the liver releasing glucose in the way you feel a stomach contraction or smell fresh bread. Glycogen support appears only indirectly, as the absence of worse symptoms. You're not yet dizzy. You're not yet deeply fatigued. Your blood sugar, assuming normal regulation, is holding fairly steady. The brain is functioning. The body is drawing on stored resources exactly as it should. If glycogen had a personality, it would probably be the person in the office who solves 6 problems before lunch and tells no one. Unspectacular, essential, faintly underappreciated. Muscle glycogen, meanwhile, remains largely separate from this public effort. This is an important detail because people often hear stored sugar and imagine one general reservoir available to every tissue equally. It is not quite like that. Muscle glycogen is there to help muscles meet their own energy demands, especially during exercise. A leg muscle does not cheerfully break down its glycogen and hand the glucose over to the bloodstream for the brain's convenience. It uses it locally. This division of labour matters a great deal if you're active during the fasting window. You may still have some liver glycogen supporting blood sugar, and yet notice a drop in performance if muscle glycogen has not been fully replenished or is being asked to do too much. Once-a-day eating can work very differently for a person doing light daily movement versus someone doing hard training in the late afternoon. The liver may still be carrying its duties well, while the muscles begin muttering about the management. This is where the body's fuel hierarchy starts to become more obvious. It does not use every available source equally in every tissue. Glucose remains important for the brain, though the brain can use ketones later on, if fasting continues long enough. Red blood cells need glucose because they lack mitochondria and cannot burn fatty acids. Muscles can use fatty acids very well at rest and during lower intensity work, but for high intensity efforts they prefer quicker carbohydrate-derived energy. The liver coordinates, stores, releases, and in later stages manufactures glucose. Adipose tissue releases fatty acids when insulin is low enough. The whole arrangement is less like a single fuel tank and more like a small economy with multiple budgets, departments, and one exhausted central office trying to keep things balanced. During this stretch, the person eating once a day often feels something that is difficult to describe neatly. Hunger may not be violent, but there is less cushioning now. The liver is doing its job, yes, but the certainty of being well fed has faded. Appetite may come and go. Energy may be mostly steady but slightly thinner around the edges. There is often a sense that the body is holding a line rather than luxuriating. It is not depleted, but it is no longer relaxed in the way it is after a substantial meal. If the afternoon were a conversation, earlier it was casual and easy. Now it has become more attentive. The body is still coping well, but it is listening more carefully to the possibility of food. That listening is influenced by activity. Suppose you take a brisk walk, do housework, or spend the afternoon moving around more than usual. The body may accelerate its use of available fuels, particularly glycogen in the liver and muscles. Hunger may become more noticeable, or it may briefly recede because movement shifts attention and mobilizes fuel differently. People vary a lot here. Some feel wonderfully steady once they get moving. Others feel that exercise in the later fasting window makes food thoughts louder by an almost comic degree. There is no universal rule except that movement changes the arithmetic. A quiet afternoon at a desk asks one question of glycogen. Carrying groceries up 3 flights of stairs asks another. There is also the matter of stress, which enters metabolism as it enters most things, by making them a bit more complicated. If stress is high, cortisol and adrenaline may contribute to maintaining blood glucose, which can be useful in the short term but does not always feel pleasant. A stressed fasting body can feel more wired, more restless, more preoccupied. The same liver glycogen that might otherwise support a calm afternoon can become part of a tenser system if the nervous system is on edge. So the stage on which stored sugar performs is not always peaceful. Sometimes it is supporting a serene stretch of work. Sometimes it is keeping you upright during a difficult meeting while someone says, "Let's circle back for the 4th time." The chemistry is real in both cases, but the experience differs. One of the subtler points here is that glycogen is limited, and the body knows this perfectly well. It is useful but not endless. A healthy liver stores enough glycogen to help maintain blood sugar for a while, not indefinitely. That is why this stage has a specific feel. It is stable, yes, but it is transitional. The body is drawing on a reserve designed to bridge gaps, not to supply all needs forever. The longer the fasting window extends, the more the body must prepare to shift emphasis again. Fatty acid use becomes increasingly important. Gluconeogenesis, the production of glucose from non-carbohydrate precursors such as lactate, glycerol, and certain amino acids, becomes more relevant. Ketone production will rise later if the fast continues long enough. Glycogen takes the stage, but it does not intend to remain there all night. That temporary quality is part of what makes the one meal day interesting from the inside. You can feel the body solving one problem while already setting up the solution to the next. The liver releases glucose, but lower insulin is also allowing greater fat mobilization. The brain remains glucose dependent enough to care, but the broader system is becoming more comfortable with fat as a background fuel. In a sense, the body is laying track ahead of the train. It does not wait for glycogen to vanish dramatically before considering other options. It begins blending them in. Metabolism likes overlap. It likes redundancy. It likes to avoid hard stops whenever possible. This is also where some people notice that hunger can level off for a while. That surprises many first-time fasters who expect appetite to rise like a staircase. Instead, it may soften or become less emotional. Part of this can come from the body settling into a rhythm of glycogen support and increased fat availability. The first hunger wave was partly about noticing the absence of food. This stage can feel more settled because the body has accepted that food is not currently arriving and has organised itself accordingly. It is the difference between realising the supermarket is closed and actually deciding what to cook from the cupboard. The first realisation may be annoying. The second can be strangely calm. Not everyone gets that calm, of course. If the one meal was too small, poorly balanced, or too early relative to the rest of the day, glycogen stores may not feel especially generous. A person may become increasingly distracted, tired, or fixated on food. This is one of the great practical truths behind all elegant talk of fasting. The meal has to be real. It has to contain enough energy and enough nutrients to support the span you're asking the body to cross. Otherwise, the afternoon becomes less a graceful metabolic transition and more a prolonged argument. The liver can help, fat stores can help, hormones can adapt. But there are limits to how charming biology remains when repeatedly underfed. Meal composition matters here in ways people do not always appreciate. Protein does not refill glycogen directly in the same dramatic way carbohydrate does, but it can support satiety and help preserve lean tissue. Carbohydrate replenishes glycogen more straightforwardly. Fat contributes energy and can support longer satiety, while also slowing digestion. Fiber changes the rate at which nutrients arrive and can affect both blood sugar response and fullness. A mixed meal can therefore produce a more even transition into this glycogen-supported period. A meal made mostly of refined carbohydrate might briefly overstate abundance, and then leave the body with less structure afterward. A very low carbohydrate meal might push the body sooner toward greater fat dependence. Again, these are not moral categories. They are different metabolic routes through the same afternoon. What the brain notices during this time is not just hunger, but reliability. If blood glucose remains stable, the brain is less likely to throw a full tantrum. It may still make food highly interesting, but it usually functions reasonably well. That stability is why glycogen matters so much. It protects the brain from abruptness. We tend to romanticize fasting in cultural terms as discipline or clarity or ancestral wisdom, but a great deal of whether it feels tolerable simply comes down to whether the body can maintain a steady enough internal environment while doing it. The liver's slow, controlled release of glucose is a large part of that story. There is also a mild shift in how the body feels physically. The heaviness of digestion is largely gone by now, especially if the meal was many hours earlier. Some people enjoy this part. They feel lighter, less burdened, perhaps a bit sharper. Others feel slightly hollow or cool. The stomach is quieter. The intestines are less center stage. The energy of the body feels less like a recent meal and more like stored momentum. This can be pleasant or disconcerting depending on temperament. Some people like the sense that they are running on internal order rather than constant intake. Others begin counting the hours to dinner with a level of seriousness usually reserved for train timetables. As the daylight fades, glycogen keeps doing its job, but the body is already thinking beyond it. That is the key. This is not the end state. It is the bridge into the longer fasting stretch, the point where stored sugar carries things forward while other systems grow more prominent. The liver can maintain blood glucose for a time. Fatty acids are increasingly available for many tissues. The brain is still being protected from abrupt swings. The person may feel surprisingly normal, annoyingly hungry, slightly cold, pleasantly clear, or some combination of all four. But beneath all of that, the day is moving toward evening, and evening asks a different question than afternoon. Because once stored sugar has done its polite, practical work for long enough, the body cannot go on pretending that this is merely a delayed snack. The short-term reserves begin to matter less as the longer overnight machinery takes over. Hormones continue to shift. Fat moves from helpful support to major fuel source for much of the body. The liver keeps balancing glucose but must increasingly do so in cooperation with deeper fasting processes. And that is where the mood changes again, because after glycogen has carried you through the middle hours, the whole arrangement starts feeling less like an afternoon without food and more like the body settling into its night work. By evening, the whole tone of the fast begins to change. The afternoon was still, in a sense, negotiating. Stored sugar was doing most of the obvious bridging work, the liver was releasing glucose from glycogen, the brain was being kept comfortable enough to stay functional, and the body was managing the long gap without food in a way that was practical rather than dramatic. Night is different. Night asks for a longer stretch. Night assumes that no meal is coming for quite some time and the body starts behaving accordingly. This is where eating once a day becomes less about simply not snacking, and more about entering a genuine overnight metabolic mode, one in which the body stops expecting quick outside supply and settles more fully into internal management. The phrase metabolic night shift sounds a little like something involving tiny workers in reflective jackets wandering through the liver with clipboards, but there is some truth in the feeling of a handover. The daytime arrangement does not so much end as give way. Glycogen is still relevant, especially earlier in the evening, but it is no longer the whole story. Insulin is low. Digestion is no longer dominating the body's resources. The gut has largely moved on from processing that one meal. The blood is no longer carrying a strong signal of recent feeding. Instead, the body enters the more sustained fasting machinery that humans rely on every night. Only here the gap is longer and more deliberate because there was only one meal to begin with. This is a useful moment to remember that sleeping is not a biological pause button. The body does not tuck itself under a blanket and do nothing for 8 hours. Quite the opposite. Night is one of its busiest administrative periods. Tissues are repaired, hormones shift in pattern, brain activity changes character, energy continues to be consumed, and fuel still has to be supplied with great care. The body must keep blood glucose in a workable range, keep the brain supplied, keep the heart beating, keep breathing going, keep the temperature regulated, and keep countless cellular tasks moving forward, all without the handy arrival of a sandwich at midnight. That is why the night shift matters so much. It shows how thoroughly the human body is designed to run on stored resources when outside food is absent. Earlier in the day, you may still have felt that food was just delayed. By evening, that illusion becomes harder to maintain. If you ate once, many hours ago, the body is no longer in a mood to treat this as a slightly disorganized lunch schedule. It begins to commit. Liver glycogen continues to be used to support blood glucose, but as the fasting window lengthens, the body increasingly leans on another strategy as well: greater use of fat-derived fuel for tissues that can handle it, while protecting glucose for those that need it most. This is not yet the grand finale of fasting physiology, but it is the beginning of a more serious redistribution. That redistribution is one of the body's oldest survival skills. In the fed state, there is no great need to be choosy. Fuel is arriving. Use some, store some, move things where they need to go. In the longer fasted state, the body becomes much more selective. It starts asking which tissues can switch comfortably to fatty acids, which tissues still require glucose, and how best to stretch the available stores so that the whole organism remains stable until the next meal. This is not a desperate act. It is normal physiology. What changes in a once-a-day pattern is simply how much time the body spends practicing it. The liver remains central to this evening handover. It keeps releasing glucose from glycogen as needed, but it also begins to increase another process, gluconeogenesis, which is the production of new glucose from non-carbohydrate materials. The raw ingredients for that can include lactate, glycerol from the breakdown of stored fat, and certain amino acids. This is often described in a dramatic tone online, as though the body instantly starts eating itself the moment dinner is skipped, but that is not really how it works. Gluconeogenesis is a normal ongoing process. It happens to some extent even in ordinary overnight fasting. What changes now is the degree of reliance on it as the gap from the last meal stretches further. The body is not losing its composure, it is broadening its supply chain. At the same time, adipose tissue becomes more metabolically useful. During the fed state, insulin tells fat cells, among other things, that they can relax a bit. Fuel has arrived from outside. When insulin falls, that suppression is lifted, and stored triglycerides in fat tissue are broken down into fatty acids and glycerol. Those fatty acids circulate and can be burned by many tissues including muscle, the liver, and much of the body's quieter overnight machinery. Fat, which is often discussed as though it were a passive aesthetic inconvenience, turns out to be a remarkably practical energy reserve. It does exactly what it was built to do. It carries the body through the hours when no new calories arrive. This is where the experience of evening hunger can become quite mixed. Some people feel a second wind once the body settles more fully into the fasted state. The earlier appetite waves of the afternoon may soften. Food remains attractive, certainly, and the idea of a late meal may still have enormous emotional appeal, but the frantic edge can ease. The body has stopped hoping that a snack may yet appear, and has begun running on internal order instead. Others feel the opposite. Evening becomes the hardest part. Family members are eating, kitchens are active, habit is strong. The body is tired from the day. The comforting ritual of dinner is right there, visible and fragrant, and the fact that one's metabolism is cleverly mobilizing fat in the background is not always enough to make that seem cheerful. The circadian rhythm complicates this further. Human metabolism does not operate in the same way at every hour of the day. Insulin sensitivity tends to be better earlier rather than later. Digestion has its own daily rhythms, and hormones shift in patterned ways across the 24-hour cycle. So when you're fasting deep into the evening on a one-meal schedule, you're not just dealing with fuel status. You're dealing with time of day. The body knows it is night. It is preparing for sleep, for tissue maintenance, for a different autonomic balance, and for many people, for lower activity. That can make fasting feel easier in one sense because the body is built for an overnight fast anyway. But it can also make it feel stranger if your one meal was early and the evening is long, because social life and appetite cues tend to gather around exactly the time the body expects rest and routine. If sleep is approaching, another set of hormonal events begins to matter more. Growth hormone is secreted in pulses, especially during early sleep, and plays roles in tissue repair, fat metabolism, and the regulation of body composition over time. It is not a miracle switch, and it should not be treated as one, but it does fit neatly into the broader overnight picture. The body uses the sleeping hours for maintenance as well as energy management. Lower insulin, continued fasting, and the normal architecture of sleep together create an environment in which the body is not processing meals, but repairing, reallocating, and maintaining. This does not mean every fasted sleeper wakes transformed into a statue from antiquity. It means the body is built to do serious housekeeping when food is not arriving, and consciousness is out of the way. Sleep itself is also affected by the one-meal pattern, in ways that are not the same for everyone. Some people sleep beautifully when they go to bed several hours after their single meal. They feel light, undisturbed, free from late digestive discomfort, and pleasantly settled. Others sleep poorly if the fasting window is too long by bedtime. They may feel too hungry, too alert, or too preoccupied with food. A very large meal too close to sleep can also disrupt things, causing heaviness, reflux, warmth, and a sense that the stomach has been given far too much to do, just as the rest of the body is trying to lie down and be sensible. So once a day eating interacts with sleep in a practical way. Timing matters, composition matters. The body may be capable of fasting overnight, but it still has preferences about whether bedtime feels comfortably empty or rudely underfed. The brain during the night shift is particularly interesting because it continues to require careful fuel support even while consciousness changes. During sleep, the brain is not thinking about dinner, but it is hardly idle. Memory processing, waste clearance, coordinated oscillations across sleep stages, autonomic regulation, and a great many other tasks continue. Glucose remains important. The body therefore works hard to keep supply steady. As the fast lengthens, the liver's balancing act becomes more sophisticated. Glycogen continues to contribute as long as it can. Gluconeogenesis becomes more important. Fatty acids support many other tissues so that glucose can be reserved where it is most needed. And this is where the body begins to edge toward a more notable change in fuel preference. The liver, when fatty acid availability is high and fasting continues, begins producing ketone bodies. This does not happen in a magical flash at some universal clock time. It depends on prior diet, activity, adaptation to fasting, glycogen status, and individual metabolism. But during the metabolic night shift, ketone production often starts becoming more relevant than it was earlier. These ketones, mainly beta-hydroxybutyrate and acetoacetate, provide an alternative fuel that many tissues, including the brain to some extent, can use. The brain does not abandon glucose entirely, especially not in an ordinary overnight fast, but ketones can reduce its need for glucose and help ease the metabolic burden of prolonged fasting. People sometimes speak of ketones with the intensity usually reserved for moon landings, as though the body has discovered an entirely secret engine. In truth, they are simply one of the standard backup systems humans evolved to use during fasting. Useful, elegant, very old, and not in the least mystical. The night shift is where this system begins to matter more, because the body is now looking beyond short-term sugar storage and toward broader fuel flexibility. The liver says, in effect, if we are going to be doing this for a while, let us diversify. That diversification is part of why morning can feel surprisingly different from late afternoon in a one-meal routine. The afternoon hunger wave is often noisy because the body is transitioning away from the fed state and still very aware of the absence of expected food. Night can be quieter. The body is no longer arguing about whether a snack would have been nice. It has moved on to running the house with the doors locked. The systems are organised. The priorities are clear. Fuel is being supplied internally. The person asleep knows very little about this, which is probably for the best, because there are only so many sleep interruptions one can bear, and your liver is now increasing ketone production would be a rather unreasonable one. Body temperature, heart rate variability, and autonomic tone also shift through the night in patterned ways. The body is not simply conserving energy by lying motionless. It is coordinating sleep stages, regulating temperature, managing blood pressure, and maintaining the internal environment while activity drops and feeding remains absent. In a fasting state, some people feel cooler, and this can carry into the night. Others feel comfortable, especially if the earlier meal was large. Again, the one-meal pattern exposes these differences because it concentrates the day's intake into one event and leaves the rest of the cycle comparatively bare. The digestive tract, meanwhile, finally gets some relative quiet. This is easy to forget because we usually think about the absence of food in terms of hunger, rather than in terms of workload. But a long fasting window also means periods in which the stomach, pancreas, gallbladder and intestines are not continuously processing incoming material. That does not mean they switch off completely. The gut remains active, motility continues, secretions continue at baseline levels, and the intestinal lining remains one of the busiest tissues in the body. But there is a difference between maintaining the system and processing another full meal. Some people feel better for that rest. Others simply notice that the familiar evening heaviness of repeated eating is gone. There is a temptation at this point in the story to become too romantic about fasting and to imply that every cell begins thanking you for the extra empty hours. Biology is usually less sentimental than that. Yes, fasting activates various maintenance pathways. Yes, low insulin and the absence of incoming nutrients change signaling inside cells. Yes, processes related to repair, nutrient sensing and cellular cleanup behave differently in the fasted state than in the fed state. But the body does not reward every longer gap with a halo. It is always balancing costs and benefits. A person who is underfed overall, sleeping badly, losing too much lean mass, or living in constant stress may not experience the night shift as a tidy metabolic gift. The same pathways exist, but context matters enormously. That context includes the total adequacy of the one meal. If the single daily meal is generous, balanced, and nutritionally competent, the body enters the overnight fast with supplies reasonably well arranged. If it was small, chaotic, or deficient in key nutrients, the night shift becomes less graceful. The body can still maintain blood sugar, mobilize fat, and produce ketones to some degree, but it does so against a thinner margin. This is one reason two people can both say they eat once a day and have entirely different experiences. The schedule is the same. The internal preparation is not. There is also the matter of muscle. Overnight fasting is normal, but protein distribution across the day still matters for muscle maintenance and repair. A single meal can provide a large pulse of amino acids, and that is certainly useful, but it means there are long stretches without another substantial protein signal. For some people, especially sedentary individuals with modest muscle demands, this may not cause obvious short-term trouble. For others, particularly older adults, or those trying to maximize muscle retention or growth, the night shift may reveal one of the trade-offs of once-a-day eating. The body can maintain overnight fuel supply very skillfully, but that does not mean every aspect of nutrition is equally optimized by a single daily feeding. Energy and repair do not always ask the same things of a schedule. As the night continues, the body settles into an increasingly stable fasting rhythm. Liver glycogen may be getting lower, gluconeogenesis is more active, fatty acids are being used broadly, ketones are becoming more present, insulin remains low. The digestive tract is quiet compared with the bustle of the fed state. Sleep, if it comes, takes over the conscious mind while metabolism carries on beneath it with practiced confidence. This is the metabolic night shift in full effect. Not a crisis, not a miracle, but a long orderly period in which the body supplies itself from within. And perhaps the most impressive thing about it is how unremarkable it can feel from the outside. A person goes to bed. They turn off the light. They sleep, toss, dream, wake briefly, sleep again. No one would guess from the room's quiet that an enormous amount of fuel management is underway. The liver is portioning out glucose. Fat cells are releasing stored energy. The brain is being protected from interruption. Hormones are rising and falling in timed patterns. Cells are continuing their repair and their housekeeping. The body is, quite literally, feeding itself from what it saved earlier. By the time morning approaches, the once-a-day eater has crossed a much deeper fasting interval than someone who spread food across the day and had a late snack. The night has moved the body further away from the last meal and further into its internal reserve systems. That is why morning hunger can feel different from afternoon hunger, and why the body by this point is no longer just leaning a little on stored fuel. It is depending on it more seriously. Glycogen helped bridge the gap, but it cannot remain the star forever. As those reserves thin and the fasting window stretches onward, another fuel source becomes more than supporting cost. Fat is no longer just helping quietly in the background. It is moving toward the center of the stage. That is the point at which fat stops being a reserve the body is politely aware of and becomes a working fuel in a much more direct sense. Earlier in the fast stored sugar, especially liver glycogen, was doing a great deal of the visible support. It kept blood glucose steady. gave the brain a dependable supply and helped the body move from the fed state into the longer gap without having to make a great spectacle of it. But glycogen is not endless, and the body has never expected it to be. It is a bridge, not a permanent residence. Once the fast continues long enough, and once insulin remains low enough, the body changes its main strategy. It starts relying more openly on the large, quiet energy reserve it has been carrying all along. This shift is one of the most practical things human metabolism can do. If the body could only run efficiently on recently eaten carbohydrate, our species would have needed a picnic basket every 6 steps and a formal dinner every nightfall. Instead, the body stores a far larger amount of energy as fat, because fat is compact, efficient, and very useful when food is absent. It is easy to speak of body fat as though it were simply excess, but biologically it is a carefully managed reserve. It is fuel stored for later, and later has now arrived. The process begins in earnest when insulin stays low, and fat cells are no longer being told to hold tightly to their contents. Adipose tissue breaks down triglycerides into fatty acids and glycerol. Those fatty acids are released into the bloodstream where they are carried to tissues that can burn them. The heart is perfectly happy to use fatty acids. Muscles use them readily, especially at rest or during low to moderate activity. The liver takes them up as well, both to burn and to convert some of them into ketone bodies if the fast continues long enough. In other words, the body does not just glance in the direction of its fat stores and sigh wistfully. It opens the account and starts spending. This can feel strange from the inside because the body does not announce the shift in grand terms. There is no internal voice saying, "Very good, we are now transitioning to increased lipid oxidation." More often, what you notice is a change in texture. The earlier hunger may soften or at least become less jagged. The body may feel lighter than it did after the meal, and steadier than it did during the first noisy waves of appetite. Some people report a kind of clean, functional energy here. Others feel cool, spare, a little detached from comfort. The difference often depends on how adapted they are to fasting, how well they slept, what they ate in that one meal, and what the rest of the day has demanded of them. Adaptation matters more than many people realize. A body used to frequent meals and regular snacks tends to complain more when asked to spend long hours without incoming food. A body accustomed to longer gaps often becomes less dramatic about the same transition. The enzymes involved in fat oxidation can become more active. Tissues become more comfortable with fatty acid use, and the whole process feels less like improvisation and more like routine. That is why 2 people can go the same length of time without food and have entirely different experiences. One feels betrayed by their own metabolism at 5 p.m. The other feels mostly normal and perhaps a bit smug, which is not a metabolic state exactly, but it does occur. Even when the shift goes smoothly, it is not magic. Burning more fat during a fast does not mean the body has entered a mythical realm in which all needs are effortlessly met and all biological trade-offs disappear in a mist of self-congratulation. It simply means the body is using the fuel it has available in a sensible order. Low insulin opens the door. Fatty acids move into circulation. Tissues capable of using them do so. This helps spare glucose for those tissues that still need it more urgently. It is a clever arrangement, but it remains an arrangement, not a miracle. The liver becomes especially interesting here because it is no longer just a glycogen dispenser. As fatty acid delivery increases, the liver begins producing ketone bodies in more meaningful amounts. This happens because fatty acids are broken down into acetyl-CoA, and when enough of that accumulates under fasting conditions, the liver turns some of it into ketones. These ketones then circulate and can be used by other tissues, including the brain to a partial degree. This is one of the body's favourite tricks during prolonged fasting. Rather than insisting that every important tissue continue relying on glucose at the same rate, it introduces an alternative fuel and thereby reduces the pressure on blood glucose maintenance. That reduction matters because the brain is a demanding organ. It does not use fatty acids directly in the same way muscles do, at least not as a main fuel, but it can use ketones. Not entirely, not instantly, and not to the exclusion of glucose, but enough to make a substantial difference during longer fasting. This does not mean that after one evening without food, your brain has become some shimmering ketone-powered supercomputer. It means that the body is gradually broadening the fuel mix. Glucose still matters, the liver still works to maintain it, but ketones begin to take some of the burden off, which makes the whole fasting state more sustainable. This is one reason the later part of a fasting window can feel different from the middle. The middle often feels most argumentative. Appetite is loud. The body is shifting away from the fed state, and the brain is still quite invested in the idea that food should probably be obtained soon. Later, once fatty acid use and ketone production are more established, the mood sometimes changes. Not always, but often enough to be noticeable. The body seems to settle. Hunger may still be there, but it's sometimes less sharp and more distant, as though it has taken a seat in the next room rather than standing directly over your shoulder, making forceful suggestions about toast. Of course, not everyone finds this pleasant. Some people feel a bit flat at this stage. Others feel cold. Some feel mentally clearer. Some begin fantasizing about breakfast with alarming detail. The body's fuel shift is real, but the subjective experience is influenced by many things beyond fuel alone. Hormones, sleep debt, stress, hydration, electrolyte balance, and simple temperament all matter. A person who is calm, hydrated, and familiar with fasting may feel surprisingly steady. A person who is stressed, tired, and trying this after a haphazard meal may feel like a polite ghost haunting their own kitchen. There is also a strong difference between resting and exercising in this phase. At rest, or during gentle movement, many tissues are very comfortable using fatty acids. Walking, household chores, sitting at a desk, reading, light errands, all of these can be supported quite well by a body that has shifted toward fat use. The trouble appears when demands become more intense. High-intensity exercise still leans more heavily on carbohydrate and glycogen, so someone deep into a one-meal fasting window may feel perfectly fine while moving gently through the evening, then distinctly less enchanted if they decide it is the perfect moment for sprints, hill intervals, or any activity that invites the muscles to start writing checks in glucose. The body has changed its fuel strategy, yes, but it has not repealed the laws of muscle physiology in the process. What you're really seeing here is fuel selection. The body is asking, with great practicality, which tissues can run on fatty acids, which can make use of ketones, and which still need glucose protected for them. It is not trying to prove a philosophical point about fasting. It is simply balancing supply. Muscles and heart make generous use of fat. The liver keeps coordinating. The brain accepts some ketones as they become available. Red blood cells continue requiring glucose. The body shifts the heavy work where it can and saves the more limited glucose-dependent pathways where it must. There is something deeply elegant about this. Not mystical, just elegant. In the same way that a well-run household quietly reallocates heat, light, and effort when the weather changes. One of the reasons body fat is so useful for this is its sheer energy density. Gram for gram, fat stores far more energy than glycogen. Glycogen is useful, quick to access, and important for short-term stability, but it is bulky and stored with water. Fat is more compact. That is why the body keeps a relatively modest amount of glycogen and a much larger reserve as fat. If you're eating once a day, or fasting for long stretches, you're asking the body to use the architecture it has had all along. The evening and overnight fast become a demonstration of what those reserves are for. Still, the fact that fat is available does not settle every question. The body can have energy stored and yet still care deeply about meal timing, especially if that one meal pattern continues day after day. Fat supports the fuel economy, but hormones and appetite systems continue to monitor the situation closely. The body is not just an engine with a tank. It is an endocrine negotiation carried out by tissues with different preferences, the brain being the least shy about expressing its own, which is why someone can be using stored fat successfully and still find themselves quite interested in food, human company, and any nearby source of warm carbohydrates. A curious thing happens here with appetite perception. During the earlier hunger waves, the absence of food can feel immediate and personal. Later, when the body is more firmly using internal fuel, hunger sometimes becomes less urgent but more atmospheric. It is no longer always a stomach-led sensation. It can become a mental occupation, a sort of background food awareness. The idea of eating remains highly attractive, but the body may not be sending the same sharp physical signals every minute. For some people, this feels empowering. For others, it is merely irritating in a more abstract way, which is not quite the same thing as empowerment, however one tries to market it. Ketones, when they begin rising more meaningfully, also contribute to this change in feel. They are not just a fuel source. They can influence the fasting experience in ways people often describe as steadier or quieter. That description should be taken cautiously, because online discussions of ketones tend to drift either into worship or into eye-rolling dismissal. In reality, they are simply part of the body's normal fasting toolkit, useful, measurable, and often accompanied by a different mental and physical feel than the earlier glycogen dominant phase. Some people notice the difference clearly, others do not. Biology is not always considerate enough to make its transitions dramatic for the sake of clarity. There can be small outward clues though. Breath may change slightly, especially in longer or repeated fasting states, because acetone, one of the ketone bodies, or rather a byproduct related to them, can leave through the lungs. It is not always noticeable, and thankfully the body does not insist on making a theatrical announcement of its ketone status to every nearby person. But the chemistry is there. The liver is producing alternative fuel, the blood is carrying it, and tissues are using it. The one-meal day, stretched over enough hours, begins to resemble a normal overnight fast turned up in volume. What this does not mean is that the body has become indifferent to food. This is one of the more persistent myths around fasting. People sometimes imagine that once fat burning begins in earnest, appetite should vanish and every person should feel serene, focused, and spiritually aligned with their mitochondria. Real life is less obliging. Appetite is shaped by hormones, yes, but also by habit, social context, stress, sleep, smell, memory, and the simple pleasure of eating. A body can be running efficiently on internal fuel and still think a bowl of soup sounds like one of civilization's better ideas. These are not contradictory states. They are just human. There is another trade-off here that is worth mentioning calmly, because it tends to get lost between extremes. A body using more fat during fasting is demonstrating flexibility, which is valuable. But if the one meal pattern leads to chronically inadequate energy or protein intake, the long fast can gradually become less kind to lean tissue, mood, and performance. The body will protect essential functions first. It always does. If resources are not coming in often enough or adequately enough, less urgent priorities begin to suffer. This is one reason the one meal has to be nutritionally serious. It cannot merely be dramatic in size. It needs protein, minerals, vitamins, enough total energy, and a composition that gives the body something sensible to work with. Otherwise, the body's increasing dependence on fat can become less a sign of healthy flexibility and more a sign that it is making the best of limited circumstances. Temperature is often part of this story too. Some people feel distinctly cooler once the body is well into the fasting state. Part of that may be the absence of repeated thermic effects from meals. Digestion itself generates heat. Part may be related to circulation, energy conservation, or simply the subjective feel of being fasted for many hours. Once fat becomes a main fuel for much of the body, the energy supply is still there, but the experience of comfort is not always identical to the fed state. You may be functioning well enough and still want a blanket. This is an entirely sensible biological opinion. The heart, incidentally, is one of the quieter success stories in this shift. It uses fatty acids very readily and spends much of its life contentedly doing so. While the brain tends to dominate our imagination whenever fuel is discussed, many other tissues are doing excellent work with fat long before the brain starts asking for ketones. Muscles at rest, liver and heart, make this transition with more ease than people often appreciate. That is part of why the body can remain so functional during long stretches without food. Not every tissue is standing around waiting for glucose deliveries like a disappointed customer. Many are perfectly capable of changing menus, and that menu change is exactly what allows the body to preserve the remaining glycogen and maintain blood sugar more calmly. If muscles and other tissues are increasingly burning fatty acids, less glucose is needed overall. If the brain can begin using some ketones, less glucose is needed there too. The burden on the liver is reduced, even as it continues to play conductor. This is how the body makes a long fast workable. It does not simply stretch one fuel source until it snaps. It rotates duties. It redesigns the evening economy. It tells some tissues to use fat, others to accept ketones, and keeps glucose for the places where no substitute quite does the job. From the outside, though, this may just look like a person sitting on a sofa, going to bed, answering a message, or waking in the night and wondering briefly about breakfast. That is one of the more delightful things about physiology. Vast coordination often hides behind very ordinary scenes. Someone deep into the once-a-day rhythm may look entirely unremarkable, while their liver is packaging ketones, their fat tissue is releasing fuel, and their muscles are quietly running on resources stored days, weeks, or months ago. The body is an excellent accountant when left to its own devices. By morning, this fat-centered phase can be even more obvious. The body has crossed the entire night without fresh intake. Glycogen support has continued but diminished. Fatty acids have been doing a great deal of the work. Ketones may be higher than they were the evening before. Hunger may be muted, or it may come roaring back depending on the person, the prior meal, and the body's own preferences. But one thing is unmistakable. The fuel strategy has changed. The meal is now truly in the past. The body is sustaining itself largely from within. And that is where the story begins to widen beyond fuel alone, because once the body has changed what it is burning, the effects are no longer confined to energy management. Hormones have been shifting all along. Mood has been changing with them. Appetite has been arguing, receding, and returning in different forms. The brain has been tracking not just calories but comfort, reward, routine, and timing. Which is why the next part of the day is never only about whether the body can burn fat. It is also about how the fasting window changes the way you feel, think, and respond when the chemistry of hunger and the psychology of wanting food begin to overlap more completely. What becomes impossible to ignore by this point is that fasting is never only about fuel. It is also about signals, and signals have a way of becoming feelings long before they become emergencies. The body has changed what it is using for energy. Stored sugar has done its portion of the work. Fatty acids are circulating more freely. Ketones may be beginning to take on a more noticeable role. All of that is real, measurable, and rather impressive. But none of it happens in emotional silence. The longer the fasting window stretches, the more the body begins speaking in hormones, and the more those hormones start changing not just what you are burning, but how the day feels from the inside. That slow change in tone, from comfortably fed to watchful, from mildly hungry to intensely aware of food, is part of the same calm explanatory style that shaped the reference script. Appetite, after all, is not a single voice. It is a panel discussion. Ghrelin speaks up when food is expected, or when the stomach has been empty for a while. Leptin sends broader reports about long-term energy stores, though it is less dramatic in the moment than people sometimes imagine. Insulin communicates the recent arrival of food and influences what tissues do with it. Cortisol adjusts energy availability under stress. Peptide, CYY, GLP-1, and cholecystokinin help tell the brain that a meal has happened and that perhaps the biscuit tin can remain untroubled for a little while. Dopamine-related reward circuits affect how strongly food captures attention. Serotonin, sleep routine, memory, and even boredom all push their chairs up to the same table. So when someone says they feel hungry, or edgy, or flat, or strangely focused during a one-meal day, that feeling is not coming from one little switch being flipped in the abdomen. It is the result of a whole system conducting a conversation. Ghrelin is often the first hormone to get blamed or credited depending on one's mood. It is commonly called the hunger hormone, which is not wrong so much as incomplete. Ghrelin does tend to rise before meals and fall after eating. It helps stimulate appetite, and it can make food seem more compelling, more noticeable, more deserving of serious thought. But ghrelin is also a creature of habit. It does not merely respond to empty stomachs, it responds to patterns. If you normally eat lunch at 1, ghrelin may rise before 1. If you usually snack at 4, it may begin politely clearing its throat sometime around 3:30. That is why eating once a day can feel hardest, not when the body is truly at its lowest point, but when the clock arrives at a time that used to mean crackers, tea, supper, or something warm delivered on a plate. The body learns timing and then behaves as though timing matters, which, to be fair, it often does. This has an odd effect on the mood of the day. The first wave of appetite can feel deeply personal, as if your stomach has developed opinions. Then, if you do not eat, the wave may pass somewhat, only to return later with a different quality. At 1 hour it feels like a physical ache. Later it may feel more like fixation. You're less bothered by the sensation in your stomach, and more bothered by the existence of food in the world. Someone opens a packet nearby and you notice from 3 rooms away. A neighbour heats soup and somehow the whole building becomes a broth-themed argument. This is not weakness. It is attention being redirected by a brain that has decided food is relevant again. Leptin is quieter but no less important. It is produced by fat tissue and reflects, in a broad long-term sense, how much stored energy the body has available. If ghrelin is often about the near horizon, leptin is more like the annual budget. It tells the brain something about longer-term reserve status. When energy stores are ample, leptin tends to be higher. When they fall, leptin tends to decrease, and the body becomes more motivated to restore balance. But leptin is not a simple daily appetite dial. It does not generally swing up and down with each meal the way ghrelin does. Instead, it contributes to the background setting in which all the more immediate signals are interpreted. A body with comfortable reserves may tolerate a long fasting window more calmly. A body under long-term strain, dieting hard or running low on energy, may hear every ghrelin whisper as a full parliamentary demand. This is one reason eating once a day can feel very different depending on whether it is done from a place of nourishment or from a place of shortage. A well-fed body with reasonable reserves may interpret the long gap as an inconvenience, sometimes even an interesting one. A body already undersupplied may interpret the same gap as a more urgent problem. The schedule can be identical while the hormonal meaning is not. This is true of many things in physiology. The clock tells only part of the story. The body's history tells the rest. Insulin, which had a leading role immediately after the meal, has now settled down considerably. That fall in insulin is what allowed stored fat to become more accessible, but it also changes appetite in less obvious ways. High insulin after a meal often travels with fullness, recent intake, and a sense that food is, at least for now, handled. Lower insulin during fasting is part of the body's more open, more searching state. It does not create hunger by itself, but it belongs to a whole hormonal setting in which the body is more willing to mobilize reserves and more interested in obtaining future supply. It is part of the reason the body no longer feels as protected from appetite as it did earlier. Then there is cortisol, a hormone that has been treated so unfairly by popular health culture that one half expects it to need legal representation. Cortisol is not merely the villain of modern life. It is an essential hormone involved in keeping you functional, alert, and metabolically flexible. It helps regulate blood pressure, the immune response, and energy availability. During fasting, cortisol can support blood glucose by encouraging processes that keep fuel available. That is useful. But cortisol also interacts with stress, and stress has a way of changing the emotional quality of appetite completely. In a calm body, hunger may feel like information. In a stressed body, the same hunger can feel like grievance. That difference matters a great deal. Someone easing through a quiet evening may feel a manageable, almost educational awareness of appetite. They notice it, observe it, perhaps even feel oddly impressed that it comes in waves rather than building endlessly. Put that same person into a tense day with poor sleep, difficult conversations, too much caffeine, and not enough patience, and fasting may suddenly feel less like a biological experiment and more like a bad personality test. The brain under stress is not looking for philosophy. It is looking for certainty, relief, and quick reward. Food offers all three. A person who could ignore appetite gracefully in one setting may become intensely snack-minded in another, not because their metabolism changed allegiance, but because stress altered the whole hormonal atmosphere. Sleep has a similar power, which is slightly irritating because it means biology keeps demanding basic maintenance from us. Poor sleep tends to make people hungrier. It can alter ghrelin and leptin patterns, heighten food reward, and increase cravings for energy-dense foods. It can also make mood less stable and self-control less elegant. So if someone is eating once a day while sleeping badly, the appetite system is already starting from a louder position. Every food cue becomes brighter. The brain begins composing thoughtful essays about bread. The body is not sabotaging you. It is reacting to a state it interprets as more demanding. This is where mood enters the picture in a more obvious way. Hunger is often discussed as a stomach event, but anyone who has lived through a delayed meal while trying to remain pleasant in public knows that appetite also affects temperament. People become shorter with one another. Minor delays seem more offensive. A harmless question can sound like a personal challenge. The famous phenomenon of being hangry survives because it is grounded in something real, though the explanation is more layered than a simple blood sugar plummet. The brain is managing competing needs. It is keeping attention on the environment, regulating emotion, and responding to a body that is increasingly interested in food. Patience, under those conditions, can become a luxury item. There is also a plain old reward issue. Food is not just fuel, it is pleasure, routine, social comfort, and sensory satisfaction. A one-meal day stretches the distance between those moments of reward. For some people, that becomes clarifying. They discover how often they were eating from cue and convenience rather than from real need. For others, it becomes emotionally flattening. The day loses some of its pleasant punctuation. A small snack is not always about calories. Sometimes it is about the human relief of stopping, tasting, sitting, and feeling, looked after by the ordinary world. Remove that, and hormones are not the only thing that changes. The emotional architecture of the day changes with it. Dopamine-related circuits play a role here because hunger increases the motivational pull of food. A biscuit at noon and the same biscuit at 10 in the evening after a long fast are not psychologically identical objects. The second biscuit glows a little brighter in the mind. It promises more. This is not because the biscuit has improved itself through effort and discipline. It is because the reward system has changed what it values. Once-a-day eating therefore affects not just the intensity of appetite, but the emotional colour of food itself. Simple things begin to seem magnificent. Toast becomes strategic. Soup becomes moving. Fruit acquires a dignity it does not always receive at 2 in the afternoon after lunch. And then there are cravings, which are hunger's more specific and occasionally more theatrical cousins. General hunger says food would be useful. A craving says it has certain ideas about what food ought to be. Sometimes that preference is physiological. Salty foods may become appealing when sodium is low. Carbohydrates may become more appealing when the brain is tired and looking for quick energy. But cravings are also shaped by memory and association. If comfort has often arrived in the form of chips, chocolate, noodles, or a late sandwich, the appetite system remembers that. During a long fast, those remembered pairings become more persuasive. The body is not just seeking calories, it is seeking the kind of relief it has learned to expect. This is where eating once a day can become socially awkward in ways metabolism textbooks rarely discuss. By evening, the hormones are not merely adjusting fuel use, they are colliding with life. Other people eat at ordinary hours, families gather around dinners, friends suggest coffee and pastries, offices continue producing the faint crackle of communal snacking, smells drift, plates appear. The body's signals now have scenery. Appetite does not unfold in a sealed room. It unfolds in kitchens, meetings, trains, shops, restaurants and homes where someone has just made something buttery. Mood is therefore shaped not only by hormones but by the relentless presence of opportunities one has decided for the time being not to take. Some people find this empowering. They feel oddly detached, as if watching their own appetite from a polite distance. They notice the wave rise, they do not obey it immediately, and eventually they realize it has changed. That can produce a sense of steadiness or even competence. Others feel haunted by the same process. They become hyper-aware of every food cue. Their mood narrows, their attention keeps wandering back to the kitchen, like a dog checking whether the door to the garden has reopened. Both responses are perfectly human. Hormones create tendencies, not identical destinies. One of the stranger parts of all this is that appetite is often more rhythmic than absolute. It does not always build in a neat line toward disaster. It comes in pulses. Ghrelin rises and falls, reward flares and softens, mood worsens, then stabilizes. A person can feel urgently hungry at 6, surprisingly normal at 7, then distinctly food-minded again at 8:30. This surprises people who imagine that hunger should behave like an empty fuel gauge, with simple continuous descent towards 0. In practice, it behaves more like the sea, advancing, retreating, returning with changed force depending on time, stress, environment, and expectation. That wave-like quality can actually be useful to understand because it changes how the whole experience is interpreted. If you think the first sharp return of appetite means the body is in serious trouble, the feeling becomes alarming. If you know it may ebb and shift, the mood stays steadier. Again, this is not an argument for ignoring genuine needs or acting as though all hunger is merely a charming mental exercise. It is simply an observation about how appetite behaves. The body often speaks in repetitions rather than verdicts. There is a further twist, and it is one that feels unfair until you remember that biology was never designed to be fair. The same fasting window can produce both irritability and clarity. Lower insulin, less digestive heaviness, and a more settled fuel strategy can make the mind feel sharper for some people. At the same time, the growing relevance of food can make the same mind less patient and more distractible. So a person may become excellent at one task and dreadful at another. They may write clearly and answer kindly less often. They may feel physically light but emotionally unconvinced. Mood during a one-meal day is therefore not just good or bad. It can become oddly selective. By now the body has also been fasting long enough for the emotional meaning of the next meal to grow. This is where anticipation becomes its own force. The idea of eating later acquires shape. The meal is no longer just necessary, it becomes symbolic. Relief, satisfaction, reward, comfort, completion, all begin attaching themselves to it. That can make appetite feel bigger than biology alone would require. A long fasting window does not just increase need, it increases importance. The coming meal starts to stand for the whole day's resolution. This matters because anticipation changes mood as surely as hormones do. Looking forward to a meal can make the final stretch feel easier, or it can make every remaining minute feel longer. It depends on the person and the setting. Some become cheerful and focused once the meal is in sight. Others become impossible to reason with while waiting for it. The body is preparing for food, the brain is imagining it, and the reward system is beginning to lean toward it with increasing confidence. A simple plate of dinner may now carry the emotional weight of a national holiday. At the same time, there is something quietly revealing about this whole stage. A one-meal day shows how much appetite lives in the overlap between chemistry and meaning. The hormones matter. Ghrelin really rises. Insulin really falls, fatty acids really circulate, cortisol really changes the feel of the fast. But the body does not experience those facts as a laboratory diagram. It experiences them as interest, impatience, longing, comfort, irritability, focus, and relief. Biology becomes mood, chemistry becomes behaviour. That is perhaps the most fascinating part of appetite. It is not merely a measurement, it is a lived translation, and that translation becomes more intense the closer the body gets to eating again. Hunger is no longer just reporting the absence of food, it is orienting the entire system toward the coming return of it. Mood sharpens around that expectation, smell matters more, taste is anticipated more vividly. The first mouthful begins to feel important before it even exists, which is why, after all these hours of hormonal negotiation, reward, restraint, and wandering thoughts about bread, the body approaches the next meal not as a casual event, but as something much larger. Soon the waiting ends, the chemistry shifts again, and the long fast meets the moment it has been preparing for all along. And then, at last, the meal arrives. After all those hours of shifting fuel sources, hormonal negotiation, mental bargaining, soft irritation, practical adaptation, and the increasingly persuasive existence of bread in the wider world, food is no longer a plan or a fantasy or a reward waiting somewhere in the near future. It is here. This moment, perhaps more than any other in a one-meal day, reveals how thoroughly the body has been preparing for its return. The reference script style leans on this same kind of calm turn from concept into lived sensation, with light humour and a soft explanatory cadence. The first thing to notice is that the body is ready before the first bite is even swallowed. In many ways it is ready before the fork is lifted. The sight of the meal, the smell of it, the expectation of it, the sheer relief of knowing that the long stretch without food is finally ending, all of these begin to change physiology almost at once. Saliva increases. Digestive secretions stir. The nervous system shifts. The stomach, empty for many hours, is no longer simply a quiet organ waiting in the dark. It has company again. This anticipatory response is not trivial. It is the body's way of beginning the meal early, before digestion, in the ordinary sense, has even fully begun. This is one reason the first few moments of eating after a long fast can feel disproportionately satisfying. The body has spent much of the day making food more meaningful, more noticeable, more attractive. Hormones have helped with that. Reward circuits have certainly helped with that. Habit, memory, comfort, and the simple relief of ending the waiting have helped too. So when the meal finally arrives, it is not just another dinner. It is the answer to a question the body has been asking for hours. That gives the first mouthful a significance it does not always have in an ordinary day of breakfast, lunch, snacks, and dinner. Soup tastes more like an event. Bread becomes diplomatic. Even a modest plate can carry the emotional gravity of a small ceremony. Of course, the body's not interested only in emotional gravity. It wants materials. It wants energy. Amino acids, minerals, water, fat, carbohydrate, texture, warmth, and a sensible distribution of all the things it has been waiting for. The moment eating begins, the fasted state starts giving way again to the fed state, though not all at once. The shift is gradual. Digestion ramps up. Absorption begins. Blood glucose may rise depending on the composition of the meal. Insulin begins to increase in response. The body, which had been relying so much more heavily on internal reserves, now starts receiving external supply again. It is a handover, a remarkably practiced one, because human beings have been moving between fed and fasted states for as long as there have been human beings. Yet a once-a-day meal often arrives with a particular challenge. Appetite is strong, but the body's ability to assess enough is not instantaneous. Satiety signals take time. The stomach will stretch, gut hormones will rise, nutrient sensing in the intestine will begin reporting back to the brain. But none of that happens with the speed of a courtroom objection. It is slower, more procedural, which means the first part of the meal is often eaten faster than the body can fully evaluate. After a long fast, a person may feel capable of eating the furniture, only to discover 20 minutes later that the actual need was somewhat less architectural than first imagined. That lag matters a great deal in a one-meal pattern. If the meal is eaten too quickly, the body may not have time to register the incoming abundance before more food has arrived than is comfortable. This can lead to the peculiar state of being ravenous at the beginning and unreasonably full by the end, as though appetite and satiety had briefly missed one another in the corridor. It is one of the practical difficulties of concentrating a whole day's eating into one event. Hunger creates urgency, but digestion still prefers patience. The body can handle a large meal, certainly, but it handles it more gracefully when it is allowed a little time to catch up with itself. The stomach, after many hours of emptiness, begins stretching again as the meal comes in. Stretch receptors in its walls send signals upward, and these contribute to the first returning sensation of fullness. At the same time, the stomach begins producing acid and churning the meal into a form the intestine can manage. If the meal is mixed, containing carbohydrate, protein, and fat, the body has to sort through a variety of jobs at once. Carbohydrates are the quickest to make themselves known in the bloodstream. Protein begins supplying amino acids for repair and maintenance. Fat slows the meal's exit from the stomach, prolonging satiety but also sometimes making a person feel that they have perhaps shown too much faith in their own capacity. This is where the quality of the meal becomes impossible to ignore. After a one-meal fast, the body is unusually honest about what it has been given. A balanced meal with substantial protein, some fibre, enough total energy, and a sensible mix of carbohydrates and fats tends to land differently from a meal built mostly from refined starch and sugar. The first sort often produces steadier fullness and a calmer return to the fed state. The second may create an initial rush, followed by a less satisfying aftermath, the bodily equivalent of receiving a great many parcels and then realizing most of them contain decorative tissue paper. Calories matter, yes, but structure matters too. A one-meal day is not just asking for energy, it is asking for adequacy. Protein is especially important here because the body has gone a long stretch without a fresh amino acid supply. During the fasting period, repair and turnover did not stop, but new building material was not arriving. Now it does. Amino acids from digested protein can support muscle protein synthesis, enzyme production, immune functions, tissue repair, and all the other ordinary miracles that make up maintenance of a living body. A person who eats once a day but skimps badly on protein is asking the body to do a great deal of housekeeping with rather poor deliveries. It will manage what it can, because that is what bodies do, but it will not be delighted. Carbohydrate plays a different role. After a long stretch without food, carbohydrate has the straightforward advantage of being able to replenish glycogen stores, especially in the liver and, depending on activity and insulin sensitivity, in muscles as well. If the day is drawn heavily on glycogen, this refilling matters. It helps restore short-term energy reserves and changes how the next fasting window will feel. A person eating once a day often discovers that the composition of tonight's meal shapes tomorrow's appetite more than they expected. A meal with enough carbohydrate to sensibly refill stores may make the next day steadier. A very low carbohydrate meal may shift the body sooner toward deeper fat and ketone reliance again. Neither pattern is automatically superior in every situation, but the body certainly notices the difference. Fat, meanwhile, contributes energy density and can make the meal more satisfying and slower to leave the stomach. It also carries fat-soluble vitamins and contributes to flavour in ways that are not to be underestimated. There is a practical honesty to appetite after a long fast. The body does not merely want numbers on a nutrition label. It wants a meal that feels like a meal. Texture, warmth, salt, richness, crunch, softness. All of these matter because the brain is part of eating too. A body that has waited all day may not be deeply impressed by a joyless plate of virtuous austerity. Satisfaction is not a frivolous side issue. It influences whether the body experiences the meal as complete. That sense of completeness is assembled from many inputs. Taste and smell provide immediate sensory reassurance. Stomach stretch says that volume has arrived. Gut hormones such as cholecystokinin, peptide WAS, and GLP-1 begin to rise, especially in response to protein and fat. Blood glucose changes, insulin rises, and the body begins shifting away from the chemistry of fasting toward the chemistry of feeding. Ghrelin, which has played such a persistent role in making food seem important, begins to fall. The brain starts receiving a very different set of messages than it was receiving an hour earlier. The environment itself changes too. Food is no longer a possibility that must be resisted or delayed. It is present, tangible, and increasingly being incorporated into you. One of the most interesting features of the one-meal day is how quickly the emotional intensity of hunger can start dissolving once eating begins. 10 minutes earlier, a person may have felt entirely governed by appetite. Then the meal starts, and already the edges soften. The world becomes less pointed. Other people become fractionally easier to admire. A spoonful of soup can achieve more social peace than a small committee. This is not purely sentimental, it is biological de-escalation. The body has moved from pursuit to acquisition. The pressure comes down because the problem is now being solved. Still, there can be a strange mismatch between the appetite that led into the meal and the actual comfortable size of the meal once satiety catches up. This is particularly true when eating once a day because the body and brain have spent so many hours building anticipation. The meal can easily become larger than intended simply because the emotional need around it has grown so large. Hunger says more, reward says more, relief says more. Yet the digestive tract remains a digestive tract. It has capacity, rhythm, preferences, and limits. A body can be deeply ready for nourishment and not especially thrilled by being asked to process a heroic banquet at conversational speed. This is why some people who practice one meal a day become quite particular about how they eat that meal. They slow down. They begin with something easy on the stomach. They structure the plate carefully. They make room for protein first. They avoid beginning with a mountain of refined carbohydrates that disappear quickly and leave the rest of the meal chasing satisfaction. Others do the opposite, of course, and spend the first 10 minutes eating with the focus of someone escaping a lifeboat. The body is adaptable, but it does appreciate a bit of strategy. As digestion gets underway, the whole metabolic atmosphere changes again. Insulin rises and begins suppressing fat release from adipose tissue. The body no longer needs to lean so heavily on its internal reserves because outside fuel is arriving. The liver, which has been balancing glucose, supplying ketones, and coordinating the fasting state through the long night and day, shifts tasks. Glycogen can be replenished, new nutrients are sorted, amino acids are processed, fat is packaged and distributed. The body does not celebrate exactly, but it does get to stop improvising from storage and return to direct supply. There is relief in that, even if most of it happens well below consciousness. The digestive tract, however, is suddenly very busy again, and after a long fast that can feel almost theatrical. Warmth returns, sleepiness may return, blood flow and autonomic balance change. A person may feel grounded, contented, pleasantly heavy, or slightly ambushed by how quickly their body has gone from sharpened appetite to post-meal gravity. This is one of the quiet ironies of once-a-day eating. You spend hours waiting for the meal, and then the meal itself can make you want to do very little except remain seated and perhaps stare fondly into the middle distance. That post-meal heaviness depends a great deal on size and composition. A very large meal, especially one rich in fat and refined carbohydrate, can produce a strong sense of torpor. The body has a lot to handle. Glucose may rise sharply, insulin may rise sharply, digestion becomes demanding. A more balanced meal may still feel substantial but less overwhelming. The body likes receiving enough. It does not always enjoy receiving too much all at once. That distinction is easy to miss when appetite has been building for 12, 16, or 20 hours. The arrival of food feels like the end of restraint, but biologically it is the beginning of workload. There is another detail here that matters more than people expect, and that is hydration. A one-meal day often means that much of the day's fluid and sodium intake may cluster around the meal too, unless a person is consciously drinking and salting food well throughout the day. When the meal finally arrives, the body may not only be taking in calories but also correcting mild fluid or electrolyte deficits. This can change how quickly a person feels better. Sometimes what looks like a miraculous restoration of life by dinner is partly the effect of finally drinking properly and eating salt with conviction. Socially, the returning meal also does something the fasting window cannot. It closes the day emotionally. Meals are not just intake, they are markers. They tell the nervous system that one phase has ended and another can begin. A long fasting day keeps that marker at a distance, which is why the meal can feel so significant when it arrives. It is not only nourishment, it is punctuation. It tells the body and the mind that waiting is over. That matters more than people sometimes admit. Much of our eating is woven into time itself. Breakfast begins the day, lunch divides it, dinner gathers it up. In a one-meal pattern, all that symbolic work is concentrated into a single event. And because of that concentration, the meal often acquires a peculiar emotional brightness. People look forward to it all day. They plan it more. They care more about its mood, its texture, its scale, its generosity. If it is disappointing, the disappointment lands harder. If it is satisfying, the satisfaction feels larger. A modest bowl of stew on an ordinary day is one thing. The same bowl after a long fast can feel almost unfairly moving. Appetite has a way of making simple food seem wise, yet the body remains practical underneath all this feeling. As the meal proceeds, satiety builds. The stomach stretches further. Nutrient sensing in the intestine grows more active. Hormones rise. Ghrelin falls. Insulin helps shuttle glucose and directs the body back towards storage where appropriate. The reward value of food remains high for a time, but eventually the physiology of fullness catches up. The appetite that seemed endless a short while ago proves, as it usually does, to have boundaries after all. This can be oddly humbling. The person who felt certain they might consume a village loaf, 3 eggs, a bowl of rice, 2 peaches, and possibly a side table discovers that the body has a more measured opinion. What happens next depends on whether the meal truly meets the day's needs. If it does, a sense of calm often follows. The body settles, mood softens, hunger recedes convincingly. The nervous system stops scanning the horizon for food. If the meal is too small, too rushed, too sugary, or too unbalanced, a more troublesome sequence may follow. A person may feel briefly full but not deeply satisfied. Blood sugar may rise and fall too briskly. Appetite may return sooner than expected, which is especially awkward if the rule is one meal, and the meal has already come and gone. The body is usually willing to cooperate with a long fasting window when the feeding window is competent. It becomes more argumentative when the meal is ceremonial in size but poor in substance. This is why the arrival of the meal is not just the end of the fast. It is the beginning of the next one. Every bite is shaping what tomorrow will feel like. Liver glycogen stores are being rebuilt or not rebuilt. Protein needs are being met or not met. Micronutrients are coming in or being neglected. Satiety is being achieved well or badly. Digestion is being respected or slightly bullied. The body is always looking ahead, even while it is handling the present. A once-a-day meal is therefore both relief and preparation. It solves one problem and immediately begins setting the terms of the next day's long interval without food. For now, though, the important fact is simple. Food has returned, the hormones are changing, the tissues are receiving what they have gone without. The body, after spending so many hours drawing on itself, can lean once again on what is entering from outside. Appetite quiets not because it was foolish, but because it has done its job. The fasted state begins to recede, the fed state returns. Warmth, fullness, and that peculiar calm after the first serious hunger has been answered start to spread through the system. And as the meal draws on, and the body keeps translating it into blood sugar, glycogen, amino acids, stored fat, tissue repair, and simple immediate comfort, another question begins to emerge beneath all the relief. After a full day of eating once, after all the shifting fuels, the changing mood, the rising and falling appetite, the body's patient dependence on what it stored and what it finally received, what does this pattern actually leave behind when the plates are cleared and the chemistry settles into its next quiet rhythm? By the time the plate is cleared and the body has begun once again to sort, absorb, store and calm itself, a rather interesting question remains behind in the room. After all the waiting, all the hormone shifts, all the returning hunger, all the fat mobilization, the glycogen bridging, the mood changes, the rising importance of the next meal, what has a day of eating once actually done? Not what the internet says it has done, which is often either too glowing to be trusted or too horrified to be useful, but what it really leaves behind in a body that has gone through the whole sequence. The reference script keeps returning to that same kind of gently widening question, moving from event to meaning in a calm, reflective way without rushing to a verdict. The first thing it leaves behind is a very clear demonstration that the body is not nearly as fragile between meals as modern life sometimes encourages us to believe. A healthy human body can move from fed to fasted, from incoming fuel to stored reserves, from glycogen support to greater fat use, with a surprising amount of competence. The liver does its work, fat cells do theirs. The brain complains in varying tones, but it is not abandoned. Blood glucose is managed, hormones adjust, appetite rises and falls rather than simply marching upward like an invading army. If you eat once in a day and make it through the whole rhythm of it, what you're left with, among other things, is evidence that your metabolism is a much more flexible system than it may have seemed at breakfast on some other, more snack-filled morning. That flexibility is valuable. It means the body can tolerate gaps. It means not every passing hunger signal deserves to be interpreted as a medical drama. It means human beings were built not only to eat, but to bridge periods when eating is not happening. There is something oddly reassuring in that. You begin the day perhaps imagining that one meal will be a rather severe experiment, and by the end you may discover that much of the experience consisted not of collapse but of adjustment. The body did not spend the day waiting helplessly beside an empty plate. It changed fuels, changed signals, changed priorities, and continued. Still, flexibility is not the same as preference, and this is one of the more important things the day leaves behind as well. The body can do something without that meaning it is ideal in every form, for every person, under every condition. Eating once a day leaves behind a very particular metabolic shape. It produces a long stretch of low insulin, long hours without fresh nutrient intake, a concentrated period of digestion, and often a stronger reliance on stored fat during the latter half of the fasting window. That can have appealing consequences for some people. Appetite may become simpler, snacking may fall away. Total daily intake may drop without much deliberate calorie counting, simply because there is less time to eat and fewer eating decisions to make. The day can feel cleaner, more structured, less interrupted by the little negotiations of coffee, biscuits, lunch, and something small at 4 o'clock that somehow has the calorie profile of a second lunch. For people who struggle most, not with main meals, but with all the drifting food in between, that can be a genuine relief. The day leaves behind fewer decisions, and fewer decisions around food can sometimes feel like peace. There is no, should I have a little something now? Because the answer has already been settled. There is one meal. The rest of the day is no. Some people find that remarkably calming, not because fasting turns them into saints, but because it removes a constant low-grade conversation they were tired of having with themselves. Appetite may still show up, but the rules are simpler, and simple rules can be surprisingly soothing to an overfed, overscheduled, overoffered modern brain. At the same time, that simplicity can leave behind another reality that is less tidy. The one meal becomes enormously important. It has to do a great deal of work. It has to provide enough total energy, enough protein, enough micronutrients, enough satisfaction, enough structure, and enough digestive tolerance to carry the body through a very long interval. If it fails in any of those areas, the cost of that failure echoes through the next day more loudly than it would in a pattern with multiple meals. Miss the mark at breakfast and lunch can help. Miss the mark on the only meal of the day, and the body has no second act to rescue the plot. That is one of the chief things the day leaves behind. Consequences are concentrated. This concentration affects nutrition in ways that are easy to underestimate. Calories are one issue, yes, but not the only one. Protein is another. A body maintaining muscle, enzymes, immune tissue, blood proteins, skin, gut lining, and all the rest of itself needs amino acids with some regularity. A single large protein meal can certainly help, and for some people it may be adequate enough, but it also means the body gets one major opportunity to receive those building blocks and then waits a very long time for the next one. For someone sedentary and generally well nourished, that may be acceptable. For someone older, very active, or trying to preserve or build significant muscle mass, the day may leave behind a small but meaningful compromise. The body managed the fasting well enough, perhaps, but the pattern may not distribute repair signals in the most favourable way. A similar thing happens with micronutrients. Vitamins and minerals are not romantic subjects, but the body is annoyingly fond of them. One meal can contain quite a lot, certainly, but in practice many one-meal patterns become repetitive. The meal grows large but not always diverse. Appetite after a long fast tends to favour foods that are immediately satisfying, and those are not always the foods most likely to create micronutrient elegance. The day leaves behind what you gave it. If the one meal was varied, balanced, and thoughtfully built, the body is better supplied. If it was merely large or mainly refined, or assembled under the emotional influence of having wanted food for 16 hours, the body may be full but not especially well provisioned. That difference between full and well provisioned is one of the most useful lessons of the whole pattern. A single day of eating once can show you how much of nourishment is not captured by that simple, glowing word full. You can be full after a meal and still not have had enough protein. You can be very full and still be low on fibre, potassium, magnesium, or any number of less glamorous essentials. You can eat enough to make the stomach feel attended to while leaving the rest of the body only moderately impressed. The one-meal day leaves behind a sort of nutritional honesty. There is less room for pretending that volume and nourishment are interchangeable. It also leaves behind a specific relationship with blood sugar and insulin. For many hours, insulin remains lower than in a standard grazing pattern. That can be metabolically useful. The body gets longer stretches in which stored fat is more accessible. Glucose regulation is not being interrupted every few hours by fresh intake. Some people with relatively stable metabolism find they feel mentally cleaner in those stretches. Others feel merely hungry, which is less glamorous but still informative. What matters is that the day clearly demonstrates how the body behaves when it is not repeatedly nudged back into the fed state. The result is not automatically miraculous, but it is distinct. For some people, that distinction supports fat loss over time. Not because once-a-day eating possesses magic hidden in its sleeve, but because it can make eating less frequent, less impulsive, and sometimes simply less excessive. A person who no longer grazes all day may consume fewer calories without trying very hard, but that outcome is not guaranteed. Some people eat very large meals in that one window, either because appetite is so strong or because the meal has become emotionally oversized. Others become so ravenous that they choose hyperpalatable foods and overshoot what they would have eaten across 2 or 3 calmer meals. So the day does not leave behind an automatic calorie deficit. It leaves behind a pattern that can reduce intake in some people and complicate it in others. This is worth saying slowly because eating patterns are so often treated like moral identities rather than practical tools. Eating once a day is not evidence of discipline in itself, nor evidence of folly in itself. It is simply an arrangement, and the body responds to arrangements in concrete terms. Over time, the arrangement may leave behind lower average calorie intake and lower body weight, or it may leave behind the same body weight only with stronger evening hunger and grander dinner plates, or it may leave behind too little intake, too much fatigue, and a creeping loss of lean mass hidden under the triumphant language of simplicity. The body is not interested in slogans, it is interested in receipts. The digestive system also has its own opinion on what is left behind. Some people feel wonderful when eating once. No constant fullness, no repeated digestive burden, no afternoon slump from a second meal, just one substantial feeding and a great deal of quiet in between. Others feel the opposite. The meal is too large, the stomach too stretched, the aftermath too heavy. Reflux appears, bloating appears. The body spends part of the day too empty and part too full, which is not always the elegant metabolic dance people had in mind. In this sense, what the day leaves behind may be digestive relief or digestive resentment. Both are honest outcomes. Social life is altered too, often more than metabolism enthusiasts care to admit. A day of eating once leaves behind fewer shared pauses, fewer ordinary rituals, fewer cups of coffee with something on the side, fewer lunches that divide the day into before and after. For some, this feels wonderfully efficient. For others, it flattens the day's emotional texture. Meals do not only provide fuel, they also provide timing, comfort, and a socially acceptable excuse to stop doing things for a moment. Remove 2 out of 3 meals and life may become simpler, but also a little barer. That too is something the day leaves behind. A change not just in chemistry, but in the structure of time. Appetite itself changes in interesting ways. One day of eating once rarely rewires the system entirely, but it leaves traces. It exposes how much hunger is learned, how often appetite shows up because the clock says it should, how powerfully smell, routine, and the sight of other people eating can awaken a desire that is not quite the same as need. It also shows how waves of hunger can pass. A person who has only ever answered every appetite cue with a bite of something may discover that hunger is more rhythmic and less absolute than expected. That knowledge can be useful even if they never eat once a day again. The body leaves behind not just hormonal residues but understanding, and yet the understanding cuts both ways. The same day may also reveal how noisy food becomes when denied for too long. It may show that the mind does not settle, but fixates. That by evening the next meal has grown so bright in imagination that it overshadows much of the day. That social occasions become awkward, concentration phrase, and an enormous amount of emotional importance gathers around dinner. If that is what the day leaves behind, the lesson is not failure, the lesson is fit. Some patterns suit some nervous systems better than others. There are people for whom reduced meal frequency produces calm, and people for whom it produces obsession wearing the clothes of discipline. Hormones leave their own signature. Ghrelin may learn the new timing over repeated days, becoming quieter at former meal times and louder near the chosen eating window. Insulin remains lower for longer stretches. Fat mobilization becomes more routine. Ketones may rise more readily with repeated practice. But alongside this, stress hormones can also become more relevant if the pattern is not going well. A body underfed, overtrained, underslept, or emotionally strained may not interpret the long fasting window as a neat metabolic challenge. It may interpret it as one more demand in a day already carrying too many. When that happens, what the day leaves behind is not clean appetite control, but a more brittle mood, more preoccupation, and sometimes a body that feels quietly cornered. Performance is another of the less glamorous leftovers. A day of eating once may leave behind perfectly adequate energy for ordinary desk work, gentle walking, errands, household tasks, and the kind of modern life that mostly involves sitting down and deciding where to click next. But ask more of the body. and the trade-offs become clearer. A person doing hard manual labour, intense training, long endurance sessions, or muscle-building work may find that the day leaves behind a flatter edge. Not necessarily disaster, just less. Less explosive power, less recovery ease, less glycogen confidence. The body can fast and perform, but not always at the same level or with the same joy. Much depends on timing, meal composition, and the sheer scale of what is being asked. There is also the question of sleep. If the one meal is timed and built well, the day may leave behind a night of comfortable fasting, steady energy, and decent rest. If the meal is too early, too small, or too unsatisfying, the night may carry a residue of alertness, food thoughts, or wakefulness that feels remarkably unfair at 2 a.m. If the meal is too large or too close to bed, the opposite problem appears. The body lies down while the stomach is still at its busiest, and sleep becomes a negotiation between digestion and gravity. So even when the day looks tidy on paper, what it leaves behind by midnight may be the truest measure of whether the pattern actually suits the person living it. One of the more subtle things the day leaves behind is a changed sense of reward. When food appears only once, that one meal grows in significance. It becomes larger in feeling than its nutrient profile alone would explain. This can be pleasant. Food becomes special again. Attention returns to taste, texture, warmth, and actual satisfaction. But it can also make the meal too emotionally central. The whole day points toward it. Too much comfort, relief, and accomplishment begin attaching themselves to one plate. That can create a strange imbalance. The body is not just being nourished. The meal is being asked to close the day, justify the fast, calm the mood, satisfy the senses, and perhaps heal a mildly difficult relationship with appetite all at once. That is a lot to ask of lentils, and still, after all those caveats, one day of eating once can leave behind something genuinely useful. Contrast. It shows the fed state by removing it for long enough that its return becomes vivid. It shows the fasted state by extending it beyond the quiet overnight version most people know. It shows what fullness feels like when it's earned, what hunger feels like when it's observed, and what metabolic flexibility looks like when the body has to rely on it for many hours in a row. Even if one decides never to repeat the pattern, the body has taught a lesson. It has shown that appetite is not constant, that hormones are persuasive but not omnipotent, that food can be both chemistry and comfort, and that the body is a much more resourceful creature than most advertising would prefer. What it leaves behind in the simplest biological sense is this: glycogen partly depleted and then replenished depending on the meal. Fat stores tapped, perhaps modestly, perhaps more substantially depending on total intake and energy use. A long interval of low insulin, a large pulse of digestion and nutrient handling, a body that spent many hours drawing on itself and then finally receiving from the outside again. But that description, while accurate, is not quite enough, because what it also leaves behind is a changed relationship to time. The hours feel different when they are not punctuated by food. The afternoon becomes longer, evening becomes more loaded. The next meal acquires shape well before it appears. In a small but meaningful way, eating once changes not just metabolism, but the architecture of the day. That architecture may suit some people beautifully. It may give the day order, reduce noise, simplify choices, and reveal that the body is calmer with fewer eating events rather than more. For others, it may feel like a day built around absence, a day in which too much thought goes into when food will return, and too much social ease is sacrificed in the process. Both can be true in different lives. Bodies are personal in the most inconvenient way. They respond not just to nutrients but to histories, habits, hopes, work schedules, family dinners, training goals, stress levels, and the ancient emotional power of warm food after a long wait. So what does a day of eating once really leave behind? It leaves behind a body that has proven it can adapt. It leaves behind a clearer view of appetite, and sometimes a harsher view of it too. It leaves behind either steadier simplicity or a more concentrated form of food preoccupation. It leaves behind practical consequences in protein distribution, glycogen restoration, digestive comfort, and social rhythm. It leaves behind no miracle, but no small achievement either. Mostly it leaves behind information. Information about what your body does when food is delayed. Information about how you respond when appetite is asked to wait. Information about whether the calm of fewer meals is for you actually calm or merely hunger dressed in tidy principles. And perhaps that is the most honest ending to the whole matter. A one-meal day does not reveal a universal truth about human health. It reveals a relationship between your body and timing, between your appetite and your routine, between your physiology and the shape of your ordinary life. By the end of it, once the meal has been eaten and the chemistry has begun to settle into another quiet overnight rhythm, you're left not with a verdict carved in stone, but with a more intimate understanding of the organism carrying you through the day. It has stored, released, argued, adapted, signalled, quieted, and carried on. And as the next stretch of fasting begins almost the moment the last bite is swallowed, the body returns once more to that old, steady work of waiting, managing, and preparing for the time when food eventually will matter all over again.